To do a complete history of what came to be known as the Philadelphia experiment, because it was not known by that name in the beginning, you have to go back to 1931, long before I was involved in it. In 1931, Nikola Tesla, Dr. John Hutchinson at the University of Chicago, and a staff physicist whose name I was given was Emil Kurtenauer, I did not know either of these other two people, became involved in what was a theoretical study of how do you make an object invisible. Now, I don't know how this came up, why it came up at that time, or whether it's strictly Tesla's idea, or whether it was a mutual idea kicked around, because at that time he did a lot of travel and he did go to the University of Chicago rather frequently. In any case, they did what we would today call a feasibility study. How can you possibly do this sort of thing? And in the process of that feasibility study, of course, in 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt became elected President of the United States, 32nd President. And he called Tesla down to Washington to talk with him as his old friend, quite literally from World War I days, when in 1917 Tesla was invited to do work for the government, which he readily did. And he was separated at that point, as were many other engineers, from the old Marconi works, actually the North American Marconi Corporation, which was dissolved. In 1919, a new company was formed called RCA. Tesla became part of that, along with many other engineers who had been originally with the Marconi works. So he was holding down a position right through 1939 as an engineer, principal engineer, chief engineer. And in 1935, he became Chief of Engineering and Research Worldwide for RCA. But this is also during the period when he was doing a few other things. He was, unlike his biographer, John J. O'Neill said, he was a recluse living in his little room in the Hotel New Yorker. He was anything but. So in this feasibility study, he was called to Washington to meet with Roosevelt again, my old friend Nikola, etc. What are you doing these days? And of course the subject of the study came up. Roosevelt made the suggestion to him after some discussion, I would like to have you continue this work. It sounds like it could be interesting as a possible military usage at some future date if it's successful. And I'll make you the director of this thing, and I'll see to it that you get some research money from the Navy. Roosevelt, of course, was a very strong Navy man and had all kinds of pull with the Navy Department. So they got money under the table, if you will, from Office of Naval Engineering to continue this research, and they moved it to a more convenient location, at least for Tesla as well as for other people, to the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton, New Jersey, which had just opened its doors, so to speak, for business in 1933. There were 4 original people who signed on as full staff members. Dr. John, excuse me, let's see, we'll take it in order. There's Dr. Alexander, whom I know very little of. There's a Dr. Oswald Veblen. There was, of course, Albert Einstein. I'm sure everybody's heard of Albert Einstein. They all signed on in 1933, as well as my old mentor, John, what is his name? Damn it.
Van Neumann?
John Van Neumann, who also signed on at that particular time. All of them came on board in 1933. Tesla was not ever officially a member of that team, was not ever officially a member of the Institute. He was a consultant to the project, and as such came in and out, and they kept no file or record on him in terms of any of the work that he did. He was not paid by the Institute. And as they told me much later when I started doing my investigations, we do not keep a file on somebody unless he's a member of the staff and paid by the Institute. So they continued their theoretical work in New Jersey instead of Chicago on Institute grounds. And of course the Institute, while it opened its doors in 1933, hardly had a real physical facility which they could call their own. So they used some of the other Princeton properties, and Institute of Advanced whatever was used in many respects as a cover for the fact they were using older buildings as part of the actual Princeton University. They did build an administrative hall called Fuld Hall, which was completed in 1939. They did build a new lab, completed in 1939. Prior to that, they had an old wooden lab building, which I still have pictures of, and they used a lot of other buildings which were loaned to them. Eventually, they had all their own facilities, but it took time and money.
How many people do you think were actually involved in the project at that time? Was it just those 4 or many others?
At the beginnings of the Institute, there were only 4 people involved as actual staff scientists. There was, of course, Mr. Bamberger, who was the director of the Institute, at least at that time in the initial years, and he took the money which had been given to them in a trust to dispense it, if you will, to the formation and control and usage of the Institute for Advanced Study. I guess the idea of the charter is to do very advanced research beyond what is normally conducted in a university setting, at least the normal universities, and it became a premier think tank. Now, of course, there were other think tanks in the U.S. There was one on the West Coast, but at that time, in the 30s and the early 40s, it was considered the premier think tank in the United States, not to say that there were not others. And, of course, it attracted people like Albert Einstein and Dr. John von Neumann, and eventually other people that came on board, like T. Townsend Brown, who became part of the Institute because of one of the projects he was working on. And I don't know to this day whether he was a full staff member or another consultant as such. He worked on a different project, but it was related, namely the problems of the German magnetic mines. That was primarily done with the Navy, but it also overlapped the Philadelphia experiment, and T. Townsend Brown became part of that experiment and the theoretical work himself, because he was an expert in RF as well as certain other areas of physics. One of the other people involved as a consultant to the project was at MIT. There was a professor there, Dr. Norman Levinson, who has a rather interesting long history. He wrote 5 books on mathematics in the public domain. John von Neumann wrote some 15, including one compilation of earlier works. And those of John von Neumann went well past the time of his alleged death in 1957. But this is somewhat getting a little ahead of the story. But these people, the 4 original staff members, saw eventually an increase in the people working there. I didn't keep track of this because I was not on staff. I was with the Navy after I joined the Navy. This all happened prior to my joining the Navy in 1939 when I finished my work on the PhD in physics. And the prior history involves the fact that they did do an early experimental test, and that was in 1936 at the Institute. It was not successful. It was essentially a failure, but apparently gave them an indication of what they were doing and where they were going, and the fact that they were more or less heading in the right direction. As what I was told later after I joined the Institute, what they were attempting to do was create an artificial field around an object which they wanted to become invisible. Of course, they start with something fairly small to begin with, perhaps like a teacup on a table, or perhaps something a little larger, but a small object requiring relatively low power. But the theory says that what they were going to do to make it invisible was see that light and any electromagnetic energy would pass either through the object or around it. And if there is no reflection from the object, obviously it is invisible. There has to be reflected light to some medium, whether it's your eye or a camera, in order for it to be detected. In case of radar, of course, to the radar detection system. The first test in 1936 was essentially unsuccessful, but it gave them some hope and apparently direction. And they kept getting the money from the Navy. And in 1939, they had hopes of a much better test, and they had a very successful one in 1940. I became part of the project along with Brother Duncan in January of 1940.
Let's go back a little bit and answer the question, why this interest in invisibility in the first place?
The interest in invisibility in the very first place was more or less of a theoretical study, like Tesla engaged in these things. Can you do this? Can you do that? And it was sort of a mental challenge to him. A, can you make an object invisible? B, can you get free power from nowheres? He was quite successful at B, to the chagrin of some other people, and of course that aspect of the work he did was later buried. And he did other things of this nature, many different projects, for the sheer sake of trying to do something new, something different. Also, of course, he had to be practical because he had a business manager who kept insisting, Mr. Tesla, you have to do something to make some money, because that was a prime concern at that time. He did not have a huge income. He didn't get his retirement income from RCA until 1939. He also had a retirement coming in sometime in the late 30s from his native country, which was then, of course, was still Serbia, but it had been more or less absorbed by Yugoslavia. He did get a pension from over there, but his primary income, after the cutoff and the help from Westinghouse, which goes back into the prior century, which was not Westinghouse's fault, or Tesla tore up the contract to save Westinghouse's ass from being taken over by a certain financial manipulator who wanted to get to control of the Westinghouse Corporation. So he had a very real concern to make money. Many of the things he did, and he had over 400 actual patents issued. Whether they were all practical or not, I don't know. But some of them certainly were. And he even wanted the things like high-frequency lighting without an incandescent lamp. He developed a free energy system, which he did demonstrate on a PSR automobile during this period of 1931-32. He developed a particle beam weapon system, which in the period of 31 to 35, he attempted to sell to the United States government. They at first showed interest in the military, then it was turned down for various reasons. Canadian government turned it down, British turned it down, but the Russians bought it, and of course that became one of their primary research weapon systems after World War II was over. And that, of course, is another story we don't need to get into at this point. But Tesla had an insatiable curiosity, and he would go into things, is it possible to do this? And that was his sole criteria. Can you do it? I want to find out. So this really got into the area of the invisibility thing. He didn't have, at that point, a practical application in mind. Roosevelt did, and that's why he was backed by the Navy. Because obviously, if you can make a ship, a tank, a vehicle invisible to anybody, and a potential enemy or whomever you want to make it invisible to, this is a great trick, if you will, a great possible advantage in a war. So that was their view as to why they wanted to push the development. Of course, as we became involved, in fact, before we became involved in World War II, with the British involvement starting in September of 1939, and the German U-boat fleets blockading Britain and cutting off their food supplies, military supplies, and almost everything, including oil, they were in a very hard strait, so they were running the blockade, and the Germans were very efficient at knocking down their ships, quite literally sinking 50% of the shipping. So they were concerned, and we were concerned, of trying to find means for either ambushing the German subs, putting them out of operation in terms of detection, or whatever technique could be used to get the shipping across the Atlantic. 1941, December, of course, on the famous December 7th, we became involved in the war. And then it became a much hotter issue because we started supplying a lot of supplies in our own ships across the Atlantic. And then we started feeling the pinch of the German U-boat fleets. So there was a real pressure to try and circumvent the German U-boat fleets. If we can make a fleet invisible, they won't be able to see where we are. We can probably sneak across the Atlantic. So then became a very heavy impetus to make the experiment successful. The first successful test was in September 1940, and it was a Navy ship, a small tender in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. It became totally invisible to sight and to a camera. They were not concerned with radar at that point because in 1940, at least so far as the U.S. Navy was concerned, it was still an experimental tool. In about 1938, they started installing experimental systems on various Navy ships to try it out. Of course, the Army played around with it, and of course the famous reports from Pearl Harbor of the radar picking up the incoming fleet of Japanese planes and the torpedo bombers which said radar report was totally ignored, I would say to the chagrin of the entire military establishment a few hours later. But they did have means for detecting them then, and of course, as time went on, the systems became much better. The Germans were perhaps ahead of us in radar development, totally independent of the British and American efforts, which were parallel, and they had good radar in their subs. And they were able to pick out the ships. Now, if we could block radar detection, we had then a huge advantage, and that was the reason they pushed on the invisibility thing. We wanted to be radar invisible as well as visually invisible. So the pressure became, after that successful test in September 1940, A, the project was classified, B, it was given a name, Project Rainbow, and C, maximum amount of effort is to be poured into this project to see if we can be successful with a much larger ship than just a tender. Because if it was to be successful, it had to include merchant ships, large military, Navy ships, possibly up to the class of a battleship. Depends on what they wanted to put in the convoy. Anything had to be made invisible. So with that first successful test, of course, Tesla went ahead to expand the project, and Roosevelt, of course, said, I'm giving you a battleship to make invisible. If you can make this invisible, you can make anything invisible, and I'll move it into the Philadelphia Navy Yard for you to work on, which he did. Now this happened in late 1940, and in January we were attached to the project from January 1940 on, after Duncan and I had finished our schooling, gone through the 90-day Wonder School of the Navy, which was more orientation than anything.
Now, that first ship that they did make invisible,
yes,
how large was it?
It was a small ship, a tender, about 350 tons. Relatively small tender at that, because they have much bigger ones. Mm-hmm. But to give you a size comparison, the later ships, they were chosen, hand-picked by Dr. von Neumann, for the test were a destroyer escort class, which typically ran around 1,600 tons. They were not very large either, but that was the displacement of 1,600 tons, which in those days was a fairly large ship, but of course no comparison with a cruiser or a battleship. The standard run-of-the-mill type destroyer escorts was what was chosen later on. But they went from the, shall we say, the sublime, a very small ship, to the ridiculous, a battleship, ridiculous in terms of the problems they had. Nothing in between was tested. They decided to go straight and directly to a huge ship, a battleship of about 30,000 tons.
Was anybody on board during the test of that very first?
No, no one was on board, which is important.
Right.
Because in the initial test, they didn't know for sure what would happen. Part of the equipment was on the decks of the tender. The very heavy electronic gear, which there was quite a bit, but nothing like the later experiments, was all on dockside, and they ran long cables to the ship. The idea was that they didn't want anybody on board the ship because they didn't know what was going to happen. They didn't know what effects might result. They didn't know if they made the ship invisible if we'd ever come back, because they were still a little bit uncertain of the mathematics that were involved. But it became invisible, and it returned when they shut the power off. It was still there. It returned, so to speak. Didn't go anywhere, but again returned to visibility.
So it was all the powered externally provided?
External, 100%.
Which is different than
it's different
than the
later tests.
Right.
In the case of the battleship, they wanted to have all of the equipment on board the ship, but at the same time, since it was a ship of the line, commissioned and operational, they didn't want to cut holes in the deck and bury equipment below deck. So they decided to leave all of the heavy equipment on the deck and build the various antenna systems, coils and such that were necessary, and just mount them on the deck. Tesla had to contend with the fact that they were going from a test of a 350-ton vehicle with relatively low power to many, many times the power, or an increase in mass of about 100-fold. Which meant a power increase of more than tenfold on that from his calculations. He decided to go up to very high level powers, and that bothered him, Tesla, because he realized as time went on, yes, we could build this equipment, yes, we could mount it on the decks of the battleship, but what is this going to do to the sailors who are on board the ship?
When was that decision made to actually put sailors on the ship?
That I can't answer. I don't know when the decision was made, if it was made per se, because they wanted a test of a ship with all personnel on board, essentially, because what use is it to have the ship invisible with nobody on board if you're going to go to sea?
So they only had one successful test, and then they were ready to jump right into a larger test with lots of people.
That is correct. That was the decision.
That was a fast-track project.
It was a fast-track project, and of course the pressure of the war was on everybody, including Tesla. And of course, after 1939, he was free to devote much more time to the project because he was out of RCA. He still was not a staff member, but he spent a lot more time on the project. Now, in January 1941, the Navy moved Duncan and I out to sea on the USS Pennsylvania, and we floated around at sea for quite a period of time, and eventually the Pennsylvania came into Pearl Harbor for overhaul, and that was in October of 1941. We took leave of San Francisco, and on December 5th, our orders were cut for return to Pearl Harbor on the 5th, because that's where the Pennsylvania was, and we were still attached to it. We had not been detached yet. And on the 5th of December, we're about to board a plane in San Francisco at Alameda Naval Air Station to fly back. And a captain says, your orders are canceled, as we were boarding the plane. And we're taken to one of the upstairs room of the Naval Air Station, met Hal Bourne Sr., the man who was in charge of the tests, theoretically, and he was actually director of the whole Office of Naval Engineering. But he came down there and he interfered and said, we're not going to Pearl Harbor, so we were told this, and we told us this. He says, we don't want you going back to Pearl Harbor. We have reason to believe the Japanese are going to attack Pearl Harbor within 48 to 72 hours. You're too valuable to us. We don't want you there. Stay here in San Francisco. In January, you'll be returned to the project at the Institute of Advanced Study. So that came to pass. We went back there and found the preparations for the test of the battleship well underway, all kinds of equipment on the deck, some still on the dockside.
Wait, how did you get from San Francisco to Philadelphia?
Well, that was by normal means. If I remember right, we went by train.
Okay, so you had orders in
Yes,
San
we had
Francisco.
orders in San Francisco. We were on orders for the ship that we had been attached to, namely the Pennsylvania, to remain with it until January of 1943. And we were told to honor those orders by being attached to it in the sense that the home base or operating base for the Pennsylvania was San Francisco, so we were at the home base.
So was that the first time when you made this trip that you had ever known about this Philadelphia experiment or Project Rainbow?
I'm not sure I follow you.
Okay, when you went from San Francisco to Philadelphia.
No, we had already been part of the project.
You had already been there, okay.
Oh yeah, we'd already been part of the project, but we're being returned to it.
Okay.
And they were supposedly near completion of the preparations for the test of the battleship.
Well, on your initial phase, when you were initially part of it, in what role, what capacity did you serve?
First, in the period from the beginning of 1940 through the summer, we spent 3 months in orientation with John von Neumann. Literally brought us up to speed on what they were doing, all the theory they were working with there, which was not taught us in the textbooks or where I was at Harvard, nor to Duncan at the University of Edinburgh. It was far ahead of what was in the books and far ahead of what was considered the normal physics theory, because they were dealing with things like multiple realities, time fields, and all of the related math, including quantum physics, as well as, unknown of course to us prior to that, the fact that Einstein had completed his unified field theory, and it was highly classified, but was available to us there working on that project. Plus some other weird stuff thrown in by Dr. Levinson out of MIT on his time equations and the time matrix and all the related stuff. So we were brought up to speed in about 3 months to understand the math, but it took actually more than that for us to really comprehend what it was we were involved in. We had no idea when we joined the Institute. We were given orders literally to go there after we finished our training at the, so to speak, the 90-day Wonder School. We had no idea what was involved, what we were going to be doing at the Institute of Advanced Study till after we were there, and they told us. They didn't tell us in advance. I'm quite certain Father knew because of his, as we found, or I found out much later, after all of this period was over, that Father was involved with intelligence out of the Pentagon and probably helped set this up. That's my assumption. I can't prove it, but I think it's reasonable, because why should two junior grade officers who had PhDs suddenly be assigned to an Institute of Advanced Study when that's not a normal place to find naval officers? But there we were. And for that matter, of course, after that, when the Navy took over the project, that became another story. There were personnel running back and forth from the headquarters of the operation in the Philadelphia Navy Yard, which was set up. But up to the point of the successful test in September 1940, we made what contributions we could, mostly learn what was going on, and occasionally help with moving equipment, testing equipment, setting things up, but most primarily observe what was going on, understand the theoretical background, and make monthly reports. The Navy wanted detailed monthly reports on the theory and everything and what was happening, how it was being implemented. And, of course, this says at the bottom line, they wanted to know what their money was being spent for and how it was being spent.
So that was your job?
That was our job.
You and Duncan to write the reports? And
right. But we were being groomed for something else in the future, which we didn't know about at that point. Eventually, with a successful system aboard a ship, somebody has to run it. And they didn't want a bunch of sailors running it, and they didn't want an ordinary officer running it who didn't understand the theory. Because not only were you entrusted with this equipment and the ship, if it became a fully successful operation, you also had to know, because of the theory that was involved, that you ran the equipment rather carefully and followed certain guidelines. Otherwise, you could find yourself dropping out of time altogether. Because what we were doing was creating an artificial time zone, if you would, and it is not that we were pushing ourselves out of the normal time flow. We were doing what you might call a phase shift number, wherein we were rotating partially out of the normal time field in that local area encompassing the ship, the fields around the ship doing this. And the object was that when you rotated far enough phase-wise, all the electromagnetic energy from outside, namely light or radar, would literally wrap itself around the ship and you never pick anything up. If it wraps around the ship, you don't see it. And that was the object. But you had to know exactly where to control the equipment at what point, and you had to know something about the characteristics of the ship, which says you ought to be trained to the job. Nobody could just come in and push a couple of buttons and turn a couple of knobs and expect everything to run right.
How did you get your training then?
That came on after September of 1940, when we were trained to the project. They started the training when the Navy pulled us out, and it was understood we would be coming back, which we did, of course, in January 42. And at that point, we became involved with Tesla quite heavily because he was proceeding towards the test date, which had been set for March. But he also was very upset and concerned about the fact that the amount of power required to make a battleship invisible was going to be quite sufficient, he thought, to, at close range, literally fry the brains of the sailors and possibly kill them. It was a very valid consideration because the amount of power they're using was up in the megawatt region. And nobody had any prior history of this, but if anybody could anticipate what might happen, Tesla was perhaps the best man around to anticipate the possible problems. Von Neumann didn't particularly agree, but he was not running the project. He was sort of second in the command. He later became first in command. And Tesla was concerned about this, voiced his thoughts and his fears to Duncan and myself, as well as to von Neumann. And went to the Navy and says, I need more time than the March date. I have to find a way to shield the personnel against possible side effects. The Navy wouldn't budge on the date. They says, do what you have to do, but you have a test date and you'll have to meet it. Quote, there's a war on, unquote. Of course there was at that point.
Well, let's get back about your training, the specific training. Seems like it would have taken a long time for you to have gone through some classes, some schools to learn how to operate this equipment. Were you taught on the job as it was being installed? Or
Exactly that. We were taught on the job as the equipment was being installed. In the case of the battleship, we were not taught on the job as it was being installed. We were observers, essentially, at that point.
Who was it that was teaching you this?
Von Neumann, primarily.
Okay.
We talked occasionally with Tesla, but he was too busy to really sit down and spend much time with us.
So was von Neumann sort of the chief engineer?
Yes, he was a very strange breed of animal, if you will. Don't mean to call him an animal, but he was a very strange breed of person because not only was he an excellent theoretical mathematician, in my view and some others, perhaps better than Einstein, but he was also an engineer. Einstein was pure theory. Von Neumann was one of those exceptional breed who could combine theory with engineering and figure out what kind of hardware had to be designed and built to implement the mathematical theory. Now this, of course, he didn't get the chance to do until after the failed test of March 42. 43, I'm sorry. No, 42. These dates. When that test failed, because Tesla deliberately sabotaged it, and he did this for a reason. He was a very ethical man, and he felt that he could not risk the lives of the sailors in a test he was quite sure would put their lives at jeopardy. The Navy wouldn't give him more time to solve the problem, which he felt it could be solved. So he chose to sabotage the test, not have anything happen like produce invisibility, and not have anyone hurt. So when this occurred, namely, he sabotaged a few pieces of equipment so nothing happened. He says the test is a failure. I'm bowing out. I have other things to do. Dr. John von Neumann would be a very good choice for the man to take over. So everybody jumped on that, including the Navy, and accepted him as follow-on. So von Neumann says, well, I have to study this problem and see what went wrong. Well, he quickly found out what went wrong. But he decided he wanted to redesign most of the equipment. Not the basic approach, but he wanted to redesign the hardware. And, of course, he said this to the Navy and proceeded to do so. Now, during this time, then, Duncan and I became much more involved, or other technicians became involved who had to help with the equipment. But, of course, there was a gap from March 42 to July 42, during which time he was doing more theory and deciding what kind of an approach he wanted and what he wanted to do in terms of those who understand the engineering. The approach that Tesla used was a pure analog approach, i.e. continuous signals, 4 different modulations on a stable continuous RF carrier, plus modulation on the electromagnetic generators, the fields that were being generated internally, which of course meant that the power out of the generators driving the coils on the deck was modulated with a special series of modulations. I don't recall much about what they were doing with that, except there were 4 frequency modulations, 4 modulations of different frequencies for the AM modulation, because it was not FM, for the antenna system. And this antenna system also required 4 RF transmitters, which were operating in conjunction with the preceding driving electronics, which produced a quadrature type of field, which was a rotating electric field set up in a quadrature antenna, which means there were 4 transmitting lobes, 4 transmitters driving it, with the associated electronics, which would produce a rotating electric field at a very low rate. As I remember now, the electric field was rotating at pi radians per second, which says 1/2 hertz. Frequency, which is to say, would take 2 seconds for the electric field to do a full 360 rotation. The magnetic field was rotating at half that frequency, pi over 2 radians per second. And the modulations on the magnetic fields were somewhat different. They also used 4 coils, so that because of the way the coils were configured and the driving was configured for the 2 generators, they could produce a quadrature field, a rotating magnetic field. The modulations were what determined the fact that you interlocked with the electric field and the magnetic field in a certain manner, so that by generating those 2 artificially, you locked in with the gravity field.
Physically, how large was this equipment that was on the ship?
In terms of which? The battleship, or in terms of the...
On the battleship, yeah. Was it quite significant?
Covered most of the forward deck.
Most of the forward deck.
Yes.
What about the back?
Nothing on the back deck.
It was just all on the forward deck.
It's all on the forward deck, and of course they had to put an antenna on the up top of the highest mast. And they had to have 4 coils, which were arranged symmetrically around the high antenna.
How large were these coils physically?
They were essentially the same coils they used later on the Eldridge. They stood about 7 feet high. They were wound as a single turn coil, copper tubing, about 1 3/4 inches in diameter, hollow, liquid cooled, because we were pumping enormous amounts of power through them. And the interesting part about this coil, it was tapered as a conical coil. See, Tesla had a very strange quirk in a lot of things. He liked to design transformers even, which were wound not the way we do them today, but tapered, a sort of a tapered conical coil. He said they were more efficient, and I believe there is mathematics today to back that up. But the coil on the deck was conically wound, so it was perhaps not more than a turn that size at the top, let's say about 6 inches. When it got down to the bottom, the single turn, if you will, which is a spiral, was about 3, if I remember correctly, about 3.5 feet broad, and had 1 feed connection on the bottom end and 1 feed connection on the top through the center. And of course there were 4 of these coils. So I remember counterclockwise wound, depends on your reference point, of course. And of course they were fed individually by 4 sets of cables. So those coils were quite large, and eventually because he used analog, this is another interesting fine engineering point, analog driving, there was no ringing problem, so there was no ringing dampening required on those coils. When it was switched to the von Neumann approach later, they had to put damping or anti-ringing coils on the top of the coils, which were literally bodily moved over to the Eldridge. They used the same coils. But the generators they used, as I recall, all of that stuff was mounted on the decks of the battleship. Some of it was on the dock side. If I remember right, they had a diesel electric generator. That was dockside. The large generators, I'm not even sure how they arranged those now, because it was not the same configuration as they later used on the Eldridge. The Eldridge, you were able to design the ship for everything being built in the interior. But they had the 2 large generators. They somehow managed to synchronize them. At least they claimed they did. We never really proved whether they were synchronized or not because the whole test was sabotaged. In the new approach, von Neumann wanted to use a digital, if I may borrow that term, a pulsed approach would be the more correct approach, but the more correct terminology, in which he had a 10% duty cycle, 10% on, 90% off, and he wanted to pulse it with very high power. He increased the size of the transmitters from approximately a 0.5 megawatt output each of the RF variety, that is 4 of them at 0.5 megawatt, to 4 of them at about 2 megawatts output, operating in essentially the same frequencies, 160 megahertz region, and of course with the modulation on that. Now I raised the question, remember this, I didn't think it was possible to generate that amount of power in the period around 1942-43 with the equipment then available. Well, it turns out, doing some research, as I ran across a book on the early radar systems for the Navy, they were generating tens of kilowatts and up to 100 kilowatts at frequencies up to 300 and 400 megahertz in 1940-41. The equipment existed, but it was not available to the civilian sector, we'll put it that way. What they built for the military was always years ahead of what the civilian sector gets, and that held true for this. The magnetic aspects, of course, was quite standard, except the generators they finally built for the Eldridge, or DE-173 as it was known before they dubbed the name on it, were quite special in design. Each had 5 field coils. That's rather odd, and I don't know why von Neumann chose to have 5 field coils, and they had 2 generators, which had to be driven by the same motor set, not a generator set, they were the generators. 750 horsepower electric motor, huge gear boxes, right angle drive. They mounted the generators vertically, that is the shafts were vertical. Shafts were about 8 inches in diameter, which they were monsters. The things were very heavy. They wanted the mass in there, the mass inertia, because you can pull out of that mass inertia enormous amounts of stored energy. And when they were pulsing the system the way he was, you had to use the mass inertia storage to get the additional electrical power out over the actual readings, which were 75 kVA each. So it became a very complex and interesting system. The 5 field coils on each one, the 10 total field coils, were driven with vacuum tubes.
Now, was all the equipment on the Eldridge on the front of the ship as it was on the other
No,
ship?
everything for the Eldridge was built underneath, below deck,
Right.
designed that way because what they did with the Eldridge, or shall I say DE-173, the one that was built for these tests was built in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, well ahead of the one of record, which is in the official Navy records, the 173 DE-173 named Eldridge, which was launched in July 43 and commissioned on September 27th or 28th of 43. That's the official record for the official Eldridge. The unofficial Eldridge, the one they used in these tests, which was given the same number and the same name, was built during the summer of 1942. That is the hull. In the summer of 1942, at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, was when the hull was finished, was launched about September of 42, moved to the Philadelphia Navy Yard, was towed over, put in dry dock, and they finished all of the rest of the work in dry dock, which meant all of the heavy interior machinery, drive systems, the ship's electric generator systems, a special diesel electric generator for this system, which was 8 megawatts. Quite a big monster. They couldn't put that on deck.
So nothing was on deck during the
Nothing
testing.
was on deck
So it
for
looked
the
like
new
a
ship.
normal ship.
It was like appear to be and look like a normal ship. And this is the way they wanted to build them, but of course this was the first one and the first of the series they hoped. So between September of 1942 and December of 1942, virtually all the heavy equipment went into the DE-173. It was still in dry dock. And they had all the heavy stuff in that they need to put in the ship, including all the normal drive systems and all the normal hardware, all of the ammo stacks, the guns, etc., except for turret number 2. That remained a dummy. There was a hole there, and they put a dummy turret on it later. When they got all the heavy stuff in, they took it out of dry dock, towed it over to the section in the back where they put in the rest of the electronics. That went on from January of 43 up through the period of June 43. Now, as Duncan and I had been selected, if you will, for these tests and for the whole project, Von Neumann decided during the summer of 1942 that what we really need, and the Navy fully agreed with him, was a specially selected test crew to be on this ship for these tests. Specially cleared, special aptitudes, etc., etc. They went throughout the whole Navy for over 3 months to get candidates they could select when they were properly selected, which included physiological testing and apparently genetic testing. For what reason, I don't know. They went through a 90-day school also, which my father, and then, of course, during World War II, working as a volunteer for the Coast Guard, trained them in a Coast Guard facility. When that was done, with pictures made of the graduating class, some 33 of them, and they were moved to the Philadelphia Navy Yard.
Now, you have this picture on the CD, correct?
Yes, I have it.
Okay.
And I'm going to take a trip.
Okay, we're starting with the second part of our Philadelphia experiment, and I think a good place to start is to describe who you knew some of the manufacturers of the equipment were.
Okay. Since originally it was a Tesla project, one has to look a little bit at the background of Tesla in order to understand why he leaned rather heavily towards Westinghouse for all of the generators and motors and such. If you go back a little bit in his history, of course, it was George Westinghouse that first set him up in terms of the patents that Tesla had for the AC motors and generators, which Westinghouse built. Westinghouse held the 20 patents and, of course, paid huge royalties to Tesla until Tesla tore up the agreement to save Mr. Westinghouse's neck. So he always had a strong favorable leaning towards Westinghouse and Westinghouse equipment. On the other hand, GE he would have nothing to do with, because GE was always backing Mr. Thomas Edison. And of course he had a very nasty run-in with Thomas Edison as one of his employers when he first came to the United States. Edison welched on an agreement to pay him $50,000 bonus if he would finish a project in time, and that project happened to be stopping the arcing of brushes in DC motors, which Edison was building then through various organizations. Edison did do quite a bit of manufacturing himself at first, but then later on became strictly the inventor and having other people do all the work. But because of that incident, he wanted nothing to do with Edison or anything that Edison was connected with, so GE was out of the picture. Now, as time went on, of course, Tesla was out of it. Von Neumann was not about to change horses in midstream, because Westinghouse certainly built good equipment. They were building very excellent equipment, and they were already supplying some of the equipment for the project. Now, insofar as the transmitters were concerned, FTR, or Federal Telephone as it was known then, later on became known as Federal Telephone and Radio after World War II, was quite a large supplier of radio transmitters for a number of years, both for the military and commercial. They're not known under that name anymore today. I'm not sure where they fall into in the current realm of transmitting equipment, and whether they're even in business anymore as such, or whether they've folded and were totally absorbed. But that was the preference and choice of Tesla at that time, and of course von Neumann followed along with it, because he wasn't about, with the pressure that was on him to get equipment built and tested, to change to another supplier in midstream and start the whole process all over again, because it doesn't make sense when you're on a tight schedule. So that was some of the names of the equipment that were involved there, and so far as winding coils and some of those other things are concerned, I think a lot of that stuff was done right in the shops of the Navy. The antenna system could have been built by FTR, could have been built in the Navy yards for that matter, because they did have manufacturing facilities. And at that point with the antenna system, excuse me, one of the other people who was involved in designing the antenna system after Tesla was out of it, as well as during the time he was in it, and a number of other consultants came in, became part of the project in one way or another, and the total number of personnel kept going up, because the aspect they considered was how fast can you get it done, or more people get it done quicker. Sometimes they get in their own way, but at least that was the thinking at the time. There was quite a lot of people involved with the project, both at the Institute and in the Navy Yard, or the principal effort was in the Navy Yard. They had a building there, shows in the pictures I have, in which the upper floor, the top floor, was actually reserved for this project and the personnel involved. And there was quite a lot of personnel at one time involved with this, because the liaison efforts for getting hardware were quite enormous. And in the war years, you wanted stuff as fast, and you had the priority system, and it was AA, single A, double A, triple A priority, and if it was a real crash priority, you had some level above that, and somebody on the phone, possibly an admiral, calling up the manufacturer and saying, we had to have this yesterday. That type of attitude prevailed all through the war and all through this project. And it got rather humorous at times, the way companies were cut out of projects and then given on a crash basis another one, or somebody who had a lower priority suddenly found themselves on the waiting list.
So would you say that this project had the highest priority possible?
It definitely did at that time have the highest priority possible. It was in the same category as some of the other projects they had with the maximum priority, like how to handle because it was involved with handling the problem of the subfleet menace, so it had the highest priority. Other things had very high priorities too, but that was on the highest echelon insofar as the Navy was concerned at that time, other than building ships, which was in a separate category. But we had to build that one ship for the test, and when it came to the time when they were ready to test equipment, the first thing they had to do was take the ship out to sea for a shakedown cruise, which is typically 3 days, and make sure it didn't leak, that everything worked, and so forth. And they had a dummy turret they put on turret number 2. And I might add that class of ship, which was a destroyer escort, only used a 3-inch gun mount at that time. They had 3 on some of them, 4 on some of the others, but they were 3-inch mounts. The 3-inch mounts did not have a fully enclosed turret. They had a partial turret, that is a sheet of heavy armor-resistant steel which stood about 6 feet, a little over 6 feet high off the deck, which shielded the gunners operating behind the gun, which had a plate mount in front of it. But it was not a complete turret, completely enclosed. When they went to the 5-inch turrets, then they enclosed them. That came on the later runs of the DEs and, of course, the larger ships, DDs. No, the DEs were smaller. The DEs, and then they came to another class afterwards, which was still bigger. Small cruisers had 5-inch and up. Large cruisers still larger. But that was the kind of equipment that we had to work with in the priority system. And after the shakedown cruise, of course, which involved a standard type of crew, they were ready to conduct the test. Then they started, shall we say, digging into the pickle barrel for the people in reserve for the actual testing of this equipment on that ship. They wanted a selected crew for several reasons. They didn't know what all may happen in terms of the effects on the personnel, number one. Number two, they wanted people who were selected which could be classified, highly classified, and kept silent, hopefully, about what happened. That fell apart later. But also that they could keep track of them in terms of medical results, medical problems that might develop. That was where Oscar Schneider came in, who was the naval officer in charge of the whole medical aspects of the test. Excuse me, Oscar Otto Schneider, Captain USN, originally in the German Navy, but that was a story that only came out much later, just before his death. It was only then that he told it to his son, and this was about 1986, approximately, he told the story.
He was a U-boat commander, wasn't he?
He was a U-boat commander originally, captured by the French about 1940, turned over to the Third Army, and then certain negotiations took place, which I've never gotten completely to the bottom of. But the U.S. Navy wanted him, and they brought him in, made him a medical officer for cover. This is my feeling, because there was no time to send him through medical school. Suddenly he was a medical officer. And he was in charge of the medical aspects.
Did you interact with Oscar Schneider very much during this experiment?
No, I saw him, but I didn't interact with him.
So
no more than in a very peremptory manner, and of course certain aspects of it. Everybody involved with the experiment who was going to be on board the ship for the test had to go through a series of medical tests, biopsies where tissue was cryogenically frozen and put into a vault for future reference.
So if he wasn't really a physician, what do you think his true role was, this Mr. Schneider?
That is something I'm still trying to get to the bottom of. But since I learned, at a much later date, of course, the fact that Phil Schneider's father, Oscar Schneider, had been in the German Navy, was a U-boat commander, and the U.S. Navy wanted him, one has to ask why, obviously. Now, when some of the answers began to came through much later, I found out, among other things, in the course of research, that the German Navy was running their own program of invisibility at that time, the same parallel with ours. Only they were not testing surface ships, they were testing it on submarines to see if they could shield them so that we couldn't detect their subs, which would make sense in terms of a war. And that test, or a series of tests, were made when they're subs at sea, and apparently they were all failures. They lost every one of them. But during the process of the earlier phases of the test, there was a liaison between the United States government officials, certain ones, and the German Navy. How this was handled, I do not know, but I do know later it turned out that somebody I met, and the whole story came out, that he was in the German Navy at that time and was actually detailed to come over to the United States, meet with personnel involved with the experiment, namely myself, at Montauk Point, when he would literally come in on a German sub, park out there off the point. They would bring him in by boat. There would be an exchange of information, and he would go back to Germany. And I was apparently authorized and ordered to give him an exchange of information. Don't ask me why. But this went on to a certain point, and it stopped. We know later, of course, that the Germans failed utterly in their testing, and they lost every sub they turned the equipment on with. They were missing something which apparently we hoped that we had, namely the magic formula to make it work. But that was one of the strange aspects, because there was that liaison going on, and that says something else. Since I've examined all of the effects that were available after Oscar's death through his son, and after his son's death, I inherited some of the books, and some of the books involved notebooks written by Oskar Schneider. I don't know when he wrote them or where he wrote them, whether it was in the U.S. or in Germany before he came into the U.S., but they detailed a lot of highly technical stuff, mathematics, and he was apparently working on the borders of, or in some manner was involved with the invisibility experiments of the Germans. That is the only thing I can see as the reason why the United States Navy would jump at the chance to get him. Otherwise, he was just a German sub-commander. Why would the U.S. Navy want a German sub-commander in the U.S. Navy?
Yeah, but then why position him as a physician?
Possibly to cover up other aspects. I'm only guessing
Hard
at this
to
point
tell, isn't it?
because I
Okay.
don't know.
So you just briefly saw Oskar Schneider from a peripheral
Right.
point.
And as it's playing his role as a physician. Now, later on, his career, and he told this to his son, and I got the information from Phil, about 1955 or 6, actually around 55, because he was still on the periphery of the experiment, still writing notes and letters regarding the Philadelphia experiment. He got fed up with the whole business, and he wanted out of the program. So he was transferred over to the nuclear sub-program, and he became part of that. He made contributions in terms of designing air conditioning hardware and such, so his mathematical background, which I saw hard evidence of, and the fact that he had engineering training apparently came to the fore, and he was useful in the nuclear sub-program. He was, of course, still an officer, a captain, and there's a picture of the launching of the first nuclear sub with him on the deck, along with a whole staff of officers who were apparently partly honorary and partly actually members of the crew. This was quite a celebration, if you will, when we built and launched our first nuclear sub. And he was part of that. So we had a long career in the Navy, and he finally retired. And he obviously was not just an MD, and nothing was ever mentioned again about him being an MD when he was working in the Navy and other projects later on. So I do think it was a cover, but I don't know the whole story. But it's a very interesting side issue.
So, well, we're at the point where we introduced Oskar Schneider,
Right.
As you just saw him as part of the experiment, and
Right.
then we'll move on from there. And I was asking about the equipment that you said there were several different manufacturers.
Yeah. I don't remember specifically any other names.
Any
as
other
such.
names? Okay.
No.
Could you describe physically what, say, inside the ship, the control panel that you and Duncan operated? What did that look like?
Actually, there's more than one. There was a primary panel, and there's a secondary one which controlled some of the settings on the auxiliary equipment.
Were these huge panels?
They weren't that large, actually. They were all stuck in the control room. And the control room was an appropriated room with other electronic equipment, in which part of the stacks of 6L6s, which drove the field coils of the two large generators, of course, 300 per coil, so there was actually 3,000 6L6s scattered around in racks all over, partly in that room, partly in a subsection on a lower deck in the ship. There was other equipment which was involved with the generating the RF frequencies and the RF modulation. There was a master control panel for the timing, for the pulse generators and such. There was a special pulse generator used. There was also another strange piece of equipment which was hidden on that rack. That was what we call the zero-time reference generator. Now that was a very special piece of equipment which I had forgotten all about until I ran into it at a much later date in another project as Al Bielek. But basically the zero-time reference generator is something which Tesla designed in the 20s, which became very useful for this project, because what it did was it established a link to the zero-time reference to the center of the galaxy. Now this may sound like far-out engineering, far beyond anything possible, but remember, Tesla was a man who was far out and did things beyond the possible. And what he did at the time was, in one of the projects he was working on at the time when the FAA was in its precursor being set up, and we were considering, of course, not only transcontinental airline traffic, but of course airline traffic worldwide eventually. And it started to come into place in the late 20s and early 30s. They had to have a navigational system for all of the available, shall we say, navigational channels, if you want to call them that, the navigational routes, wherein a plane could go from the area of one transmitting system into the next transmitting system into the next, and not have a problem with the phasing of the signals. This was a problem which was dumped in Tesla's lap. How do you design a master oscillator and a master frequency control system so that all of the systems around the world will all be operating in total unison and totally synchronized? That was a major problem. I would say today you use phase-locked oscillator systems, and of course you can do it via satellite, link them all together so that they're all phase-locked to each other. There was no way of doing that at that time. Not that they couldn't design a phase-lock oscillator, but we were talking about synchronizing systems around the planet, which nobody had a concept of how the blazes you're going to do it. Hey, Tesla, maybe you can solve this one for us. And he did. It was called the zero-time reference generator. Now, what is this thing in terms of the physical hardware? It is something which is very hard to explain. I've had units in my hands. I still use them, and because later on I found them still being used. The FAA was still using them in the 60s. They're probably still using them today. You set up in a rack box, a standard 19-inch rack, a motor operating off the AC line at 60 hertz and a generator system which generates a certain series of frequencies, and there is a feedback coupling between them, and there's a mechanical coupling, and nobody can fully explain to this day how the system works. Probably Tesla could easily, unless somebody in the secret elements of the government and the various secret communities has figured it out. At a certain point, the motor and generator system lock together. You can hear it wind up, and then it goes and locks into something, and nobody knows what it is, but you come out of the toothed wheel, which is on the back of the generator. A series of generating systems involving toothed wheels and magnetic coil pickups. The basic stable frequencies for the ILS system, 90 hertz, 150 hertz, divide down to 30, and a couple of other frequencies, including, I believe, 1 kilohertz. These things, these frequencies, are an absolute phase lock from every system that exists around the planet, no matter where it's physically located. And there's no electrical connection between the physical location of one transmitter to the next transmitter. They're locked to what is called the zero-time reference of the entire galaxy. And how Tesla figured that one out, nobody knows. But it works. And the FAA hasn't asked questions since, except the one time when I was working for one of the manufacturers. This is 1969 in Kansas City, Missouri. They were manufacturing ILS ground transmitter systems for Westinghouse, not Westinghouse, for the FAA. I looked at the schematics, I saw this thing, and I said to my bosses, in this day and age, why are they using a mechanical monstrosity like this to generate the primary frequencies? I says, why can't they use more modern electronics? He says, I've asked the same question. He says, I went back to the FAA and asked them, and they told me, quote, don't ask questions, just build it, unquote. So, there are some hidden engineering aspects of things which you don't get answers to.
Okay, so that was in the
that
room
was
where you
part
were.
of the system, and it's very important for this
Right.
reason, that it provided the reference so that actually they didn't anticipate it, but when the Eldridge, if were to move in space-time, would have a reference in order to come back to the same starting point.
Right.
And this is, of course, what eventually was responsible for the Eldridge, after it went into hyperspace, coming back. That piece of equipment had to be kept intact, and was not something we used an axe on. Other pieces of equipment, yes, but not that one.
Yeah, without that, you wouldn't know where to go back, right?
Right, the ship wouldn't know where to go back. None of the electrical systems, none of the collapsing fields would have a reference, and the ship would have no reference. They could reappear anywhere.
Anywhere's meaning
Anywhere,
any time,
any time, any physical location,
any dimension.
Anything. That was one of the key elements involved with this, and one of the strange aspects I'll get into later of why the Eldridge locked up with the Montauk project is also involved with that particular key piece of equipment, the zero-time reference generator. That was key to a lot of problems as well as solutions. But in any case, that was part of the equipment that was buried down there. There were racks of equipment. There were the two huge generators. They had to be synchronized, and they couldn't do this mechanically. And there was another man brought in who was in the Navy at the time, but apparently electrical engineering expert. He designed a system to electrically synchronize the two generators so that they would be in exact phase relationship to each other, so that the 5 coils in one and the 5 coils in the other would produce the appropriate frequencies totally phase locked to each other, so you didn't have any drifting phase between two sets of coils and the other two sets of coils. So that was another major element. There's a lot of hardware that had to be all tied together and work together. And all of the modulating systems, I don't remember the details on most of those now. But the very large equipment, I do remember fairly well.
Did you oversee any of the actual building and installation of this equipment into the ship, or when you and Duncan arrived, had it already been assembled?
No, we saw it being installed in the Eldridge because we were there at the time that all of that was ongoing. That started in the... Actually, it was about January of '43 when it started, and we were a major part of the project then. When it came to installing the equipment on the earlier sabotage test of the battleship, no, we did not see the installation. It was all there when we arrived back.
So beside Dr. Van Neumann and Oscar Schneider, were there any interesting characters assigned to this project that you know about? Can't say really that there were, other than the one RF expert. Now, had Albert Einstein kind of moved away from this after the failed test?
Well, he was never directly involved with the engineering of this test and of the equipment.
He was
a consultant.
Okay.
And he was involved in the theory. He was concerned with some of the hardware which was carried daily on board and off the ship. There's a certain key piece of equipment. I'm not sure now what that was. There is actually a photo of that somewhere in the archives. But he was concerned that certain aspects of it were carried out according to his wishes.
Did you ever meet him, Albert Einstein?
I think I met him once. It was when he was reviewing perhaps the key personnel working on board the ship at that time for that project.
Mm-hmm.
But he seldom got that involved in it. He was more an internal consultant to about a dozen projects ongoing at the Institute at that time.
Okay. So I guess we're right now at that point where they're ready to conduct the test.
Right.
With the Eldridge.
Right. They picked half of the crew, plus some officers. There was a skeleton crew on board the ship because they weren't going out in the ocean. They were just going down river, if you will. And about 6 miles down from the Navy Yard itself, adjacent to one of the islands called Tinicum Island, they theoretically dropped anchor. They did not drop anchor, but that was where they decided to become stationary in order to conduct the tests. They had one observer ship. There was an aircraft carrier. There was an officer in charge of these tests, a man by the name of Captain Harrison, who I learned all about again through his son much later in the 80s and in the 90s in Los Angeles. But he was in charge of the test in terms of the Navy's interests. Von Neumann, of course, represented the Institute and the technical interests.
So you're saying that there was an aircraft carrier that observed this test?
Yes, it was used as a small carrier, not a full-size one.
Mm-hmm.
They had some smaller ones.
Do you remember the name of that aircraft carrier?
No, I do not. I may have it in my notes, but I don't recall it now.
Mm-hmm.
But in any case, they were adjacent to the ship to observe the invisibility effect. They had sailors stationed on the deck of the Eldridge to literally observe what they saw and what happened as the fields built up and as the experiment was underway.
So when the Eldridge was out there, you said it was a couple miles downriver?
It was 6 miles downriver from the Navy Yard.
Did you actually pull the trigger to start the test?
Yes, Duncan and I literally pulled the triggers, pulled the handles, if you will.
You control the whole thing. Did you receive an order?
Yes, you got an order by radio to start with the tests. Mm-hmm. Of course, the generators were already winding up. Well, that already were wound up because it took about 10 minutes to get those up to speed.
About how many men were on board ship at this time?
My recollection is 30 to 33.
Okay.
There were some who say there were more. But the special observer crew, about half of those were on deck, exposed literally to all of the radiation. Because you had 4 coils on deck, they were quite open. You had the antenna, special antenna on the top of the mast. They were within 75 feet, any and all of them, within 75 feet of any of the coils.
Was this like 15 people were on deck and the other 15 were below? How did that work out?
About, let's see, so I believe 12 on deck.
12 on deck and the rest
below deck?
below
deck, doing the various things you had to do to run the ship, keeping the power equipment running, doing the controls from the captain up in his helm to run the ship, to control the power, etc., steering, etc.
And then you and Duncan there at the control panel.
And the control panel behind a steel bulkhead door in a special section which had been set aside for control of the equipment.
Mm-hmm. So you get the order to flip the switch, and then what happens?
Well, we turn up the drives because the generators were running, but they weren't being fed any power in the field coils to drive them. So we have to turn up the drives, which was electronic feeds, and gradually bring them up to speed. Then we had to bring them up to the power level required. The generators were already up to speed. And then turn up the drives for the RF feeds for the antenna system. And our various meters told us that the two fields were functioning and doing their number of rotating within each other. And then we stayed inside and waited for our developments. There was a radio link to the outside world. And, of course, that in the initial one, the link we had was with the captain. On the second test, they gave us a link to the outside world, so we didn't know what was going on except what the captain told us. And we let him know that everything was functioning up to its normal levels. And then about 20 minutes later, we were told to shut the equipment down, because what the observers on the carrier saw was the ship went invisible as it was supposed to. And all they could see is not even an outline of the ship, but there was an outline in the water of the bay or the river where the ship should have been, and it showed an outline for the size of the ship, except it was longer and wider, which said, A, the ship was there, and B, the fields were surrounding the ship, and because of the fields surrounding the ship, the water also became invisible, at least out to a certain point.
Mm-hmm. It seems odd that they were able to actually transmit a radio signal to you to shut the test down.
I don't know how they managed to do that, but they did.
Okay.
I didn't have any connection directly. I got it from the captain when it turned down. They couldn't do it visually because you couldn't see the ship. And so far as I know from the inside, because of everything I read afterwards,
Mm-hmm.
You couldn't see anything beyond that because it was a gray fog.
Right. Do you remember any of the names of the captain or any of the sailors that were on board?
Only one of the sailors that I remember specifically, because there is a reason why I should remember him. And that guy was Bill Cody. He was a seaman. He had the rather distinction, if you will, that he used to engage in drinking bouts, and he could drink anyone under the table, including myself, which he did once. And it was rather embarrassing for an officer to get drunk under the table by a seaman, but it happened at some of the bar festivities downtown at the Blue Lagoon, which was the name of the bar that most of the sailors went to who were from that project. And the other people know. Only the captain in charge of the test, I remember his name, Harrison. But after 20 minutes, we got the orders somehow to shut down. We did. We went back. Orders were also to return to the Navy Yard. We did, and then that's when they found out we had a sick crew. Those were on the deck. They were highly disturbed emotionally. They were disoriented physically.
But the ones below deck were fine, right?
Below deck, because of the steel shielding, we're okay. In those days, the destroyers were built of steel. Now they build them of aluminum. So the steel was an excellent shielding against the magnetic fields, because they had a shield against both RF and magnetic. The magnetic fields alone could have given them severe problems.
So you're talking about the 12 people who were above deck.
They were
pretty sick.
They were very sick, disoriented, wandering around. They hadn't fallen into the deck. They hadn't disappeared or anything, but they were quite ill and nauseous. So the Navy, of course, picked them up and went into sick bay, and Von Neumann says, we'll need a new crew, and the Navy says, not to worry, we'll have a new crew for you. And then he said to the Navy official, he says, well, I've got to study this problem, find out what is going on here, what's wrong that these guys are sick. What can we do about it? Because obviously you can't have that if you're going to go across the ocean with one ship and one complete group after another. If you're going to have a major commerce across the ocean with all the ships invisible, you can't have everybody getting sick. So he said he'd study the problem, and he said, I will need time for this. The Navy didn't say anything at first. Then they indicated to him, along about, I think, 1st of August, says, you have until the 12th of August to finish these tests or forget it, which in engineering parlance is a drop-dead test date. No one could understand why the Navy was dictating a drop-dead test date.
How much time was it? You said 12th of August, right?
Yeah, this is about 12 more days.
Oh, in 12 days, so it was like...
So everybody worked around the clock.
Wow.
And they did so, yes, we don't want optical invisibility, only radar invisibility. If you can change that so we only have radar invisibility and not optical invisibility, we would prefer this, because in those days you had no Lorentz-Sharon or all the navigational systems we have today. It's questionable whether they would have worked under those conditions too, but in any case, we don't want the ships to be invisible, because at night in a convoy we could have one ship ramming another.
Yeah, but you were so far along. I mean, this system was designed to give you invisibility.
Right.
And how could you in 12 days have any chance of changing any of the engineering around so that all you could do is have optical or radar invisibility?
Van Neumann said it was no problem to do this. You just backtrack slightly on how far you carry this in terms of the phase differential field in relation to the main field.
Mm-hmm.
And he apparently was successful in doing that, as subsequent results showed.
Okay,
about the 9th of August, everybody started to get a queasy feeling in the pit of their stomach that something was very, very wrong. Nobody had any idea what. But many people, virtually, not in the entire crew, but virtually the entire crew, felt very uneasy. As I recall, Von Neumann didn't. The other officers didn't, but I did and Duncan did. It would only be another 3 days before we found out there was really something radically wrong. But it was not with our equipment. Comes the 12th of August, of course. We go again back down to the first test site, very close to it. And then we have, for this test, 3 ships for observers. A carrier, a Coast Guard ship, name unknown, and a commercial ship, one of the merchant ships, the USS Furuseth. And, of course, the various observing people on board them. In terms of the carrier, of course, we had von Neumann, we had Captain Harrison, we had some other staff people from the Institute, as well as from the Navy Yard.
Okay, Al, what we'll do is drop it here, and then we'll pick it up right at the start of the second test. The Philadelphia Experiment. Al, this subject is perhaps what you are best known for. You played a critical role in that experiment. Now, in previous programs, you described all the work and tests leading up to that famous test on August the 13th, 1943, where the USS Eldridge became invisible. Al, let's start this program with you taking us back to that fateful morning in 1943, just before the start of the test.
Okay. By the time the 12th of August rolled around, we'd all more or less gotten used to that queasy feeling and figured, well, this is it today, whatever happens, happens. And we became somewhat resigned to it, though we still didn't understand why we were basically uneasy. So on that morning, the test crew marched aboard the ship. Duncan and I were there, and not immediately and down in the hold where we ran all the equipment, but we were on board. The captain of the ship was there, and of course, for that particular occasion, they had 3 test ships. They had, or I should say, 3 observer ships. And there were 3 test ships, too, for that matter, but we're not getting into that in this moment. Dr. von Neumann, Captain Harrison, all the others on the deck of the carrier. There was a Coast Guard cutter, was an observing ship, and the USS Furuseth, which was a standard commercial ship for hauling cargo across the Atlantic or wherever.
Were there any medical ships around?
No medical ships around per se, no. There were some medical people on board the carrier, I'm sure, but there was no specific need felt for a medical ship as such. If anything went wrong, there wasn't going to be much they could do out there in the middle of the bay anyway. They're going to have to get the ship back or unload the personnel if they had to, and take them ashore and into the yard and any of the naval facility hospitals.
So all of those ships were just sitting out there for observation purposes, right?
Now, one of the interesting points about this, which I had almost forgotten about, but is perhaps important, there was a sudden change of plans on the morning of the 12th of August. Captain Harrison, in the process of observing the first test on the 22nd of July, as I have mentioned, noticed a very large water line, much larger than the ship. The water line meaning this is where the water apparently stopped, and then you had a vacuum, so to speak, a space there you couldn't understand. And, of course, there was no ship in there, but the hole in the outline of a ship was much larger than the ship itself. And he could not see, looking through his binoculars in the deck of the carrier, he could not see where the water was down at the bottom. If, so to speak, there should have been a bottom level where you could see the water. Well, he couldn't.
Did it look like a black hole or something?
It looked very much like a black hole. Now, he was concerned that he wasn't sure whether that ship was actually riding in water that he couldn't see or whether it was floating in air. So he had planned for a series of special tests on the 12th of August, which included special seismometers, special measuring devices on board the Eldridge, including a special secondary crew just to run those pieces of equipment, and a submarine which was scheduled to go around the hole, if you will, and see, is it really a hole or what's going on here? Now, for whatever reason, at the last minute, they canceled all of those extra tests. The submarine was not scheduled in to be part of it, and the secondary crew was not put on board the ship. The equipment was already there, but they didn't use it or do anything with it. And all of the regular personnel got on board the ship. It went down river to its point where it was stationed for the test, and then by command on the radio came the orders, turn on the equipment.
Let's go back a little bit. About, again, how many people were on the ship, the Eldridge, when this actually happened on the 12th
The test
of August?
crew was, again, right around 30, it's about 35 total.
Okay, and the names of the people that you recall, certainly Duncan is one of them.
Oh, yes, Duncan was one of them.
Any others?
Myself.
Right.
Brother Jim, who was not part of the first test because they drew straws, so to speak, as to who was going to be first on the list for the first test, and then they drew the leftovers, so to speak, we used on the second test. Since Jim didn't draw the straw, our younger brother, for the first test, he was on the second one. Mm-hmm. And anyone who was not used on the first test was used on the second test. Of course, this guy I knew by the name of Wild Bill, as we nicknamed him, Wild Bill Cody, was part of the second test. And there are some other people whose names I cannot remember at this point. Because it's hard to remember the names of those people from that far back, particularly when you're going through more than one set of brainwashing techniques. But the specific ones that I've mentioned had a very good reason to remember them.
Do you remember their faces, though?
The faces?
Yeah.
Yes, some of them I do.
Right.
Because the picture of the graduating class, as we called it, for the Eldridge, or where my father was the head of it, some of those faces in there are very familiar to me, even though I do not remember the names. Not all of them. I would say about half are quite familiar.
It's interesting because a lot of the technical details, you have almost, a photographic memory about those.
Mm-hmm.
But some of the other details, such as the name of the captain or things like that, become much more difficult to you.
The captain was, of course, a temporarily assigned captain.
Right.
And I ran across that name once, but I do not recall it at this time. And some of the other personnel, in fact, all of the personnel for these tests were temporarily assigned for the specific purpose of those tests only. They were not regular crew members. They were not part of a regular crew. And the regular crew that would be assigned later on was not the people who were involved with these tests.
Okay. So about what time did this test occur?
Started right around 1000 hours, as they would call it, 10 a.m. in civilian time.
Mm-hmm.
And we turned on the equipment.
And how far out did you go?
We went downriver about 6 miles, very close to where the first test was undertaken next to Tinicum Island. And there's two other ships, the Coast Guard cutter and the SS Furiaseth, were there along with the carrier. And the Furiaseth also had an observer on it, which was a man who figured in one of the earlier books, Carlos Miguel Allende. His real name was not Carlos Miguel Allende. That was a pen name. His real name was Carl Allen, Dr. Carl Allen. He had a Ph.D. in physics, and he was an officer in the Navy. And he was assigned to the Furiaseth as an observer a little further out, but not quite as far out as the carrier was. And why they wanted him on that ship, I don't know, but that was just part of the procedures they followed. Mm-hmm. They had quite a number of observers, and because of Carl Allen's footnotes on a book many years later, other than for that, probably his name would have been long since forgotten. But he lived on in infamy, or whatever you want to call it, because of a certain book, The Case for the UFO by Morris K. Jessup, with all of the footnotes written in there, allegedly by all one person, Carlos Miguel Allende. But this happened in 1955, not 1943. Mm-hmm. But in 43, he was a naval officer on board the Furiaseth. And as the test proceeded, and the modifying requirements by the Navy that they only wanted radar invisibility, not complete optical invisibility, relaxed the requirements slightly. But the reason they stated that they only wanted radar invisibility was because at night in a storm they would not be able to see adjacent ships in a convoy, because at that time we didn't have the long-range navigation we have now. We didn't have satellites. We didn't have all of the modern systems which you can pinpoint where a ship or car or whatever is, as long as you have the transmitter on board. So the thought was, we've got to be able to see them at night, even if it's through a fog. and some kind of a signaling device so we can tell where the other ships are. This would not change in any respect the fact that the ships would be radar invisible, because radar is a different function than, let's say, a light system or a light relay or a light communication system. So the equipment was turned on. Everything seemed to be working insofar as the observers on the 3 ships were concerned for about 70 seconds. You could see the ship through a greenish haze, but you could not see it on radar. It's totally blank, which is what they wanted. Then there was a blinding flash of light of some kind, and the ship disappeared. The waterline disappeared, and it was just plain bay water. No hole, if you will, where the ship should be.
Like the last experiment had.
Like the first one had.
Yeah, right.
And with that, of course, there was panic on the carrier, and they tried to raise it by radio. They could not. You couldn't get any radio communications, whatever. And I'm sure that some hair was pulled out. That may have been where some of John von Neumann's hair disappeared. And about 4 hours later, the ship returns to the same spot from which it had departed, with noting from the decks of the carrier and the binoculars that there were some strange changes. Part of the very high antenna system, which was on top of the main antenna mast, for establishing the rotating EM the electric field as part of the EM field, was missing. There was pandemonium on the ship. It looked like there was superficial damage to the ship at certain locations, but they couldn't be sure. So they couldn't raise anyone on the radio, of course. So,
You mean
the
while it
boarding
was
party.
invisible? While it was invisible, they couldn't
And
get anyone.
they couldn't raise anyone after it was back.
Oh, really?
And that's when they said, we've got to send a boarding party out.
Okay.
So they sent the boarding party. It boarded the ship with two-way radios, I believe 4 in the boarding party. They boarded the ship and they wandered around, and the first thing they see is 2 sailors buried in a steel deck, the bodies intermingled with the steel of the deck, dying or dead. And they find 2 more upright in a bulkhead further forward from where they had boarded. They were essentially dead. 5th man was still quite alive. He had his hand buried in a bulkhead. So the medical officers, I'm not sure, but I think they left him in that position until they got the ship back in the yard, then brought the medical officers aboard, removed his hand, and then gave an artificial hand later. He was the only one of those 5 so positioned that lived. They also found pandemonium on the deck, so those sailors who had been stationed on the deck, and certain ones were fading in and out of visibility, like they were just like a mirage, disappearing and then coming back, and like so many of our sci-fi movies today have such excellent special effects, to have a person disappear and then come back. This is what was actually going on the Eldridge. And the rest of those on the decks were wandering around in a manner and mumbling and making noises like they were totally insane. Now, whether or not they were truly insane is hard to say, but that's the way they were judged by the medical people who checked them out and sent them to the funny farms. Those below deck were all right, with the exception of 1 man. They were not affected because the fields will not penetrate that much steel. They might have had a problem if this was a current design ship, i.e. where they use an aluminum hull. They use steel armor plate where it's needed, but the rest of the ship is aluminum because it's much lighter and faster that way.
But don't they have a wood deck, though?
Some of them do have a wood deck.
How about the Eldridge?
As I recall, it did not. I'm not positive at that point at this moment. Because I do not recall a wood deck on that ship. I know the battleship we were on earlier definitely had a wood deck. So the boarding party reported back what was going on. They said, we'll send another boarding party because we can't find anybody, even in the conning tower. What's happened to the captain, we're not sure, but he's not responding. We got to have somebody aboard here to steer the ship, take it back into the Navy Yard, and then offload everybody. So, a second boarding party. The ship is removed under its own power back up the river and into the back section of the Navy Yard. Then they offload everyone.
So this is an important point, though. The ship, when it returned, was still functional.
Oh, yes, it was functional. Absolutely.
And it wasn't damaged or distorted in any way.
Not other than a few minor things like a bent railing, the damaged antenna tower, and if I remember right, they said something about some damaged boilerplate or whatever it was in one of the gun turrets. there was some superficial damage to the steel outer structure. There was no damage to the main structure of the ship, nothing to interfere with its operation.
Was there any radioactivity associated with this ship when it returned?
As I recall, there was no radioactivity per se. I'm not even sure they checked for it in the same manner that they do today, which is so commonplace. But I don't believe they did check for any of it at that time. They did, I believe, later, but not at the immediate time when the ship returned.
Now, when did you actually see this boarding party? Was it the first one?
Oh, yeah.
They came and saw you?
When Duncan and I came out of the control room after the equipment, which I'll have to explain what happened, why the ship returned.
Right.
But when we came out of the control room, we saw sailors milling around. We saw 2 buried in the deck. We saw 2 buried upright, and one of them is our younger brother, Jim. And at this point, Duncan got very upset and essentially panicked. Or at least that's my interpretation of what it was. He headed for the railing and looked back at me like, aren't I coming along? Well, I had gone over to brother Jim, as he was crying and sobbing, and he was still conscious. His head and shoulders were out of the steel. He wasn't totally buried in the steel. So consequently, he remained conscious longer than the others. And tried to comfort him. At that point, Duncan jumped overboard, went back to the future, and what happened to him, as the original Duncan I've already given a description of.
Right.
Now, he was not there when the ship actually returned to its normal space-time. I was. And I made a report when we had the 4-day Board of Inquiry. And I told them exactly what I saw, and I told them that Duncan and I had been to the future in 1983 and all of this, and they looked at me with some very blank, unbelieving stares. I mean, those Navy brass did not believe a word I said.
Well, so the ship was able, on its own power, to get back to its dock, right?
Just required some personnel who were not mentally scrambled to handle it.
Okay.
Now, those below decks were all right, as I said, except for one person. That one person developed a very strange condition, and I didn't even know about it at the time, but I heard about this indirectly at a later time via, of all people, Carl Allen, who knew about it and used to talk about it at a future time from the 43 to 45 era. This one man developed an invisible arm. There's nothing wrong with his arm. It just was invisible. And nobody could explain why. But
was it a third arm?
No, it was one of his regular arms. I believe his left arm. And it was perfectly normal in terms of usage. But it was totally invisible. So what they finally decided to do, they wrapped him in a bandage, put a bandage on his arm and down over his hand to say he had been injured, and he was recovering. He had usage of his arm and hand, but he had to keep the bandage on for a period of time. Well, this became my standard cover, if you will, for quite some time after that, because I don't think they ever found a way to make his arm visible.
Oh, my God.
Rather a strange malady.
That's something new. I've not heard that part of the story yet.
I didn't hear that for a long time. I didn't know about it for a long time afterwards. But in any case, those who were on deck, they had a problem because some of them seemed to be insane. Some babbled about ETs. I didn't believe it. And I did not believe about it until I had the paperwork in my hands from Oscar Schneider after he died. He didn't tell me about it. He didn't. None of them said anything further about what they saw, except they were saying this, and nobody believed it, particularly me. Because up to that point, I had never had a contact with extraterrestrials. I had never seen any on the ship. Duncan, as far as I know, had not seen them. It all occurred in the interim while we were gone from the ship, after we jumped overboard the first time. And then before we came back, the ETs came and went. That's the only way we could piece it together and figure it out later. Because, as the record showed much later, one of them, perhaps many, were implanted by this alien group. One of them, at least, was proven that they were implanted by the records from Dr. Schneider. But I gave my report, and nobody believed it. I did not mention the ET business because I didn't believe it.
Did you ever get to go back and talk with any of the people who were on the ship at that time?
Yes, I did. I definitely did, because we were all back in the Navy Yard. I was essentially pulled off the project, but the project at that point was in limbo. And we talked with the personnel. The Navy didn't know what they wanted to do for quite a while, but I talked with these personnel, talked with some of the ones who they had judged insane, and I didn't think they were insane. I thought they were mentally scrambled, had seen something which the rest of us hadn't seen. And then there were those who were fading in and out of visibility, were literally doing a domain change, if you will, from this reality to another and back. The initial way that the sailors stopped this was for those who were still anchored here permanently, if I may put it that way. They had a laying on of hands. They put their hands on the ones who were fading out, and that seemed to give them the amount of energy they needed to stay in this domain. Later on, they developed electronic equipment to counter this, to solve the problem, and it took 6 months of work.
Where do you think they went when they
In
faded
an alternate
out?
reality. Some went out and never came back. Others were fading back in and out, coming back and forth. There was about 4 or 5 that were doing the fade in and out number.
Did a lot of them die, say, within a year after this?
Yes, within a year to 2 years after, there were quite a few dead. It wasn't a large crew to begin with, but they started dying off. Those that did not disappear, started to die off. Now, I remember that the research work involved a number of people in order to try and solve this problem. How do you keep these guys in our reality, in our domain? That work went to a number of people, but one of them I remember specifically because of research long since then. Not that I knew who it was at that time. It was a man by the name of Dr. Royal Rife, who figures in history at a later date as a man who developed the ultra-powerful optical microscope with a magnification of up to 50,000, which is theoretically impossible. I know how he did it because I figured that out finally. He used a technique which was not thought of at that time, but it is valid. It's not direct optical observation, but that's another point. It was optical, but he didn't use a direct view system. He used a rather modified technique. He was also in electronics, and he was involved with a number of things, and I was told, and finally did find out, that a lot of the files regarding what happened to the Philadelphia experiment was in Royal Rife's hands because he worked on the project directly. They pulled in a lot of people. Anyone who they thought might be an expert and could understand what was happening to these sailors, come in and try and solve this problem, see if you can design some hardware which would keep them stable. They did. It took about 6 months, but they did finally design some stabilizing hardware, which Royal Rife was part of. And what basically they were doing was a little black box, if you will, that you put on the guy's belt. This thing would be turned on, and it radiated some kind of a field which kept the guy stable. I do not understand the mechanism in terms of what electromagnetics they were using, in terms of what was the biological problem, beyond biology, but what was the actual nature of the problem that they were fading in and out of reality.
So did you, as Ed Cameron, though, have to wear that box?
No, I did not, because I was not affected that way.
Only the people above the deck, right?
Only the people who are above the deck who were directly exposed to the radiations of the hardware, namely the RF fields from the antenna and the electromagnetic, or the magnetic fields per se from the coils, which included some electromagnetic component, but basically a magnetic field. The combined effect of those two fields for a couple of hours. How many hours is hard to say, because in terms of 1943 time was about 4 hours. In terms of elapsed time for the Eldridge being gone into hyperspace, and the time which Duncan and I spent in 1983, it was approximately 12 hours. Time is flexible, it is not linear, and it can be, shall we say, bent. And under the circumstances of the hyperspace field, it was bent. How long that ship was really in hyperspace is anyone's guess, because you could not measure with a clock. And therefore, those guys were exposed to those fields for quite a long time, and it was almost lethal. Today we know this sort of thing. At that time it was unknown. Only Tesla suspected it, and he suspected quite correctly what the problems might be. So I gave my report. And
so I guess they were wondering, where in the hell is Duncan?
Yes, I told them that Duncan jumped back overboard and disappeared, and I said, I suspect he went back to the future. That's all I could tell him. Yeah. I didn't know where he went, but that was the obvious and logical conclusion because of what happened the first time.
Were there any other sailors missing?
There was a total of about 6 missing. We know of 5 that were missing totally, jumped overboard. And they disappeared. Now, why Duncan and I survived the overboard bit is something you can probably spend a lot of time on arguing and never come up with an answer. Our survival apparently was arranged by someone and was for a purpose. The other guys who jumped overboard were not supposed to jump overboard, and whoever was looking out for us didn't look out for them, and they evaporated.
Did they jump overboard after you two jumped overboard?
Yes.
Maybe in a sense following you, right?
They jumped overboard after the, let us say, the pressure of the field effects that they were being exposed to, and the effects on their minds got to be too much. They jumped overboard just trying to get away from it. As I say, those below decks were not affected, only those on the deck.
But you were still affected for that short while you were above deck to jump overboard.
We would have been affected for a short period of time, but it didn't have enough time element comprised there to cause a major problem, because it took more than 5 or 10 minutes of that kind of exposure. I would estimate about half an hour of exposure before it really started to get to you.
But you were only gone for 20 minutes. The ship was only disappeared for 20 minutes, correct?
And the first test, not the second test,
Test
was 4 hours.
4 hours, I'm sorry, okay.
Which is more than enough time. We were in the control room until we came out of there, perhaps for 10 minutes, if that much. And then we came out on the deck, and we immediately headed overboard.
Well, should we now move to your perspective, as you and Duncan are now in the
Yes.
control room?
Okay.
Okay, let's take it from the point where you switch on the equipment, and then what happened from your perspective?
As we switched on the equipment, at first everything functioned in the normal manner, the way I expected it to. And all of the meters, if you will, gave normal readings. And we were there about 30 seconds into the test when we realized something wasn't quite right. And the reason we realized something wasn't quite right was because all these huge banks of electron tubes. See, the field coils of the two alternators were driven by banks of 6L6 tubes. They had to be modulated in a special way, plus the normal drive signals to make the alternator do what it was supposed to do, plus modulate the output signal, required a lot of amplifiers, and it actually took 300 6L6s to drive each one of those coils on each alternator. There were 5 field coils on each alternator. So literally 10 field coils, 300 tubes for each. That's 3,000 6L6 tubes. That's a lot of 6L6 tubes, all glass versions.
And that's a lot of heat as well.
And that's a lot of heat. And they were not only in our control room, they were in an adjacent room. And as we were looking at this casually, we were seeing something happen which doesn't happen normally, unless you have an enormous fluctuation in the supply, the heater supply to the heaters. They started to dim and get brighter and get dim and get brighter. And I was watching and said, what the Hades is going on here? And then we started to notice something else in the control room. We were starting to look like high voltage arc overs. And there was no high voltage equipment in the control room. There was elsewhere, but not there. And we're seeing this arcing, jumping of what appeared to be high voltage electricity across the space in the control room. In retrospect, we can look at this and say this was not high voltage as we know it. This was etheric energy that was arcing over because of the stress of the hyperspace field. It was producing some very weird results. And they started to show up in the control room. We didn't know what it was.
And about how much time into the experiment did this show up?
In terms of
from when you turned it on?
When we turned the equipment on and we knew everything was functional, about 30 seconds.
Oh, quickly.
30 to 40 seconds. At the time when we knew the equipment was fully on and everything was operational, it was about 30 seconds. And we tried, after we looked at this, and we couldn't determine what's going on, we decided, as we were given the prerogatives to decide, if something's wrong, it's up to us to decide. Do we turn the equipment off? Do we make adjustments? Or what? We decided to turn it off, because we figured there's something erratic here, very heavily wrong. So we went to turn off the AC controls and all of the AC power drives and everything else. Nothing could be turned off. All of the control handles, knobs, what have you, were frozen. We knew then something was very definitely wrong. We had no idea what. And at this point, we decided there's nothing we can do out of here. So we opened the bulkhead door, went out on deck, saw sailors milling around. None were frozen in the deck at this point. Nothing looked abnormal except for the fact that the sailors were moving around in a very strange, haphazard, and, shall we say, nervous manner.
Now, how far into the experiment was it before you actually went aboard deck?
About 2 minutes,
That's all.
2 to 3 minutes. We had no idea that the ship had already gone into hyperspace. The only thing we saw when we went out on deck was you could not see the horizon, you could not see adjacent land. All you could see was a gray fog, which was just a little bit beyond the railing of the ship. On the deck, you could see quite clearly, and there were the sailors milling about, and we decided, there's nothing we can do here. Let's get out of here. We don't know what's going on. We will jump overboard and swim ashore. We were both excellent swimmers, and we figured at that point it was about, at maximum, half an hour to shore. Half a mile to shore, and it was not a long swim for us. Let's jump overboard. So we both did. And that is the point where things got very strange. We did not hit the water. There was no water. We just started to fall. The feeling was like you were falling down an elevator shaft with no bottom. And we just kept falling and falling and falling and falling. And what is this?
What were you thinking at that time?
We weren't thinking, I can assure you.
You were in
we
panic,
were
weren't you?
in a state of panic, virtually. Yeah. And
Could you see him, though, as you were going down,
Yes.
or did you feel alone?
no, I could see Duncan hazily. And see, then the whole sequence of what happened from that point on became very, very bizarre, because we came out of this sort of hazy area where we were falling through it, but I could barely see him, but he was there fairly close to me. We could see each other. Suddenly, we came out of this hazy area into a brightly lit area with what appeared to be fluffy clouds, and here we are going through, we don't know where, in what was open sky. Couldn't see ground, couldn't see anything else, open sky and a cloudy effect. And we're moving through this for a period of time. Then all of a sudden, we blank out. And then we came to, we were in the hospital in 2137.
So was it like you were flying?
It was like we were flying, exactly.
Wow.
That was the feeling, the sensation. Not like we were falling at that point, but like we were flying. Can't explain it, no, to this day, except that's what we felt and what we noted.
Was it a pleasant feeling, though?
At that point it was.
Mm-hmm.
The terror was gone, but at this point, where are we? What's going on? Type thing.
Wow.
We didn't talk to each other. We were in no position to talk. We were just observing and in a state of complete mental disarrangement, if you will.
Indeed.
Where are we going? What is happening? And these were not verbalized thoughts. These were just, what next type thing. And
Okay, well, we've gotten to 2137.
Yeah.
In fact, we've done a very extensive.
yeah, well, this is how it happened.
Okay.
We maneuvered through however it was done, whoever was handling this. In retrospect, a higher power was doing this for a reason, but we wound up in 2137, and from that point on, we've already outlined quite well.
Right, and just to really quickly recap it, you were there for 6 weeks.
Yeah.
Both you and Duncan.
Correct.
And then you went from there to 2749.
Correct. Only Duncan did not.
Correct. Now, did you go there sort of like week 3 or week 6? Do you recall?
It was in the 6th week.
Or was it at the very end?
It was at the very end.
Okay, so you went to 2749. You stayed there for 2 years.
That's right.
And
In terms of the time measured then, and in terms of, I guess what one would say is wear and tear on me, perhaps.
Right, and that's where you had your interesting
Experience
with the Wingmakers.
with the Wingmakers, with the artificial intelligence computer system that ran the planet. That is, city by city it did. No such control out in the boonies. Total world population approximately 500 million. Very exotic, very large cities.
And you were a tour guide, right?
I became a tour guide along with a friend I met there who I guess got me into it.
See, that's strange because how would you had the experience to be a tour guide?
I didn't. He broke me into it. They were looking for people, as there was always apparently employment open, where nobody was paid for anything. It was a
just
sort of
like-
credit system.
Okay, hey, I need a tour guide. You're it.
Yeah. They look at you, say, you think you can handle it? Well, yeah, I've had a little instruction from my friend here. Okay, you're a tour guide.
And all these cities had anti-gravity.
The floating ones had
Floating.
anti-gravity drives. The ones that are based on the ground probably had anti-gravity platforms also, because some of them were very tall.
Did you ever go to those?
I went through and toured a couple of them, but I don't recall too clearly any of the other cities, except at a certain point I started asking too many questions, like, all right, this synthetic intelligence system is running each city. It didn't create itself. Who built these? That's, of course, when I was introduced to the Wingmakers.
Now, of all these 2 years, do you remember the names of anybody that you knew over there?
Only one, and I only know him and his name that he has used in the present era, and that I will leave out because he was a man very high up in the military with a very high clearance and doesn't want his name used. So
Today?
Today, yes.
Oh,
So
I
I'll
see.
leave that out. Other than I knew him there, and I knew him now. In fact, he told me when I first met him, he says, you met me in the 28th century. It was the first time we met. And I said, no, that was you.
Oh, he told you that? Huh.
He did.
Wow. Do you recall, however, were the names different, like Mike and Joe?
Oh, yeah.
Were they
People had regular names, normal
regular
names.
names,
like
not
they have
different
now.
names? Okay.
Yeah, and they had stores, and they had recreation, and they had movies, and they had most of everything that we would expect today, except worldwide communication was restricted. There wasn't as need for it the way we have today. They didn't have the need for computers with stock market exchanges and all that. There was no stock. There was no banks. There was no money. There were no world governments. There was no national divisions anymore. There was no standing armies. It simplified things quite a bit. The
Sounds like heaven.
closest thing you'd ever come to it, and I think after a while it got to the point where people were bored.
It was, well, yeah, that's true. No worries, right?
Right, there were no worries.
Okay, so let's go all the way to the end. Here you are. You had your 2-year experience there, which we have covered in other interviews. How did you get to the point where you left? Did you
I
just...
got to the point where I left because I was told I had to.
Okay.
I said, I don't want to go back. I want
Was
to
it the
stay here.
Wingmakers told you? Who told
Basically, it wasn't the Wingmakers so much that told me that to go back. It was the synthetic intelligence computer in the one city I was sort of stationed in. And I said, you got to go back. There's a mess you have to straighten out in the past. He says, what mess? They wouldn't really tell me.
Did you have memories? Did you know what had actually happened?
At that point, I did not.
You just thought...
No,
You
when
had
I
always
arrived,
been there.
when I arrived in 2149, memories prior to that were erased.
2749.
And 2749. Memories prior to that were erased, and it was like I had always been there. After a while, I realized that I didn't exactly belong there. Something was strange, something was wrong. And I asked many questions, in which I got usually no answers. One of them was, my friend, the tour guide, who I got very, very friendly to and quite close to. I asked him, don't I know him from somewhere else? And the flat answer was no, which was a lie. But nevertheless, that was the answer.
Where'd you know him from?
He was the same guy that died on the Philadelphia experiment. The guy known him as Bill Cody. I've been able to trace his history since. It's a long and bizarre history, but he wound up from the Eldridge in the 28th century. And eventually I wound up there. And he took me all over and got me involved as a tour guide, and apartments, housing, whatever, was rather plentiful and readily available. And if you didn't like living in the cities, you could go out and make it on your own in the back country as a hermit or a farmer or whatever. There were farms, but most farms were contained within certain city limits because the farms were contained. They didn't need the giant farms like we have today. The farming was contained, it was very well controlled, well irrigated, well nurtured, and so forth.
Was it still a small population?
500 million max for the world, and the United States, or what that territory I was in, which would have been part of the U.S., let's say for all of North America, which would include what was once Canada, from questions I asked, there was actually less than 100 million. There was more population in North America than almost anywhere else in the world at that time. So the principal concentration was still in North America.
Okay. So this computer basically said there's a mess in the past which you need to be sent to.
You have to go back to and
you
straighten
need to go
out.
back and straighten
I don't
out.
want to go back. You have to go back. I kept insisting, I want to stay here. I said, you can't. I said, what do I have to go back to? You have to go back. It wouldn't give me a direct answer. So eventually I was sent back without my knowledge of how it was done or my say-so or my approval. I was just sent back. And I was sent back completely intact, of course, in terms of health, to 2137 to the hospital to meet with Duncan. And a short time after that, Duncan and I were transferred to the incident which I've described publicly so many times, 1983 at the Montauk Point thing at approximately 2 a.m. in the morning,
Right.
and inside the perimeter of that military fence.
Let's go back to 2137 though, and the transfer. How did that happen? Was it just sort of a blink of the eyes, or was there a one
There
of
was
those
probably
holes?
equipment involved, but I can only say probably because I have no recall
You don't
of it. And
remember.
what transpired in the last hours and minutes with Duncan and I there before we were transferred, I'm sure there was more to it than I remember, and what I remember of it is very blank. And it was then, as we went back to 1983, when we arrived at 1983, suddenly all our memories of the Philadelphia experiment and what we had just gone through were back, with largely a blank out of the 2137 and the 28th century phenomena. That did come back to some extent, but it came back later. And of course, in terms of Al Bielek, it took a long time to get that back. But that was largely blanked out, but not totally blanked out. A little of it came filtering through after the sequence of returning to the Eldridge, destroying the equipment, because what they gave us instructions, of course, as I've covered from Neumann, destroy the equipment, whatever you have to do, to shut it off.
Let's go back now to Montauk, because that's where you landed,
Right.
right? Both you and your brother landed there.
Right.
And you said there's a helicopter,
Helicopter overhead with a blinding searchlight.
right? And okay, so they took you down in the underground caverns.
They took us in the underground part of Montauk, which had been built as part of Montauk specifically. In other words, they didn't go into a cavern section. We went into a artificially built section, which was where much of the work was done. A little lower was the caverns. We didn't go that far down.
So they were expecting you.
Neumann was expecting us because of the records from my report to him in 1943 of what had happened, that I'd gone into the future and had been at the 1983 end of it. I told him all of that. He didn't really believe me, but he sort of half believed me. But
So
he said later, we're going to have to do something to prove this. But he had the records of what final report he wrote, so he knew what was probably going to happen. So quite literally, he was kept on the station as a consultant until this era would happen, if it was going to happen. Other people going through the years in 1981, 82, 83 weren't quite sure whether something like this was really going to happen.
But they still had a greeting party ready for you.
Oh, yes, they had a party ready for us in case we arrived, which we did. And, of course, then we met Van Neumann, and Van Neumann told us the problem and so forth, and then, of course, we were shipped back to the Eldridge.
Well, let's go back, because we haven't really explored this one part.
Okay.
Here it is. You see Dr. Van Neumann. He's quite a bit older
Quite a bit, 40 years older.
than when you left.
Yes.
Well, what was the shock that you experienced when here he is, you see him?
At first, I would say at first there was no shock because we didn't recognize him. And when he said, I am Dr. John Van Neumann, the same one you knew in 1943, except I'm 40 years older, and you're at Montauk, Long Island, we didn't believe him. We told him, he says, you can't be. He said, I am, and he was insistent on it. And he says, never mind, come with me. So he gave us the cook's tour of the underground, or the computers, and all of the various electronic systems, none of which existed in 43. And we were, shall we say, ogle-eyed at this stuff. And computers, people were talking about computers in 1943, and that's all they were doing, about what was going to happen after the war. We were going to have to do some entirely new computing techniques. They did have the analog computer at Harvard functional in 1943. They had some other calculating devices which were at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, which were not computers, but they were calculators, very large electronic calculators, and they knew the day was coming for a computer which could do the computations automatically, but it was not there yet. But then we were confronted with it in 1983, and we see all these computers. And
Were
what's
these
this?
IBM computers?
Yes, IBM 360s and 370s, plus the hard drives, plus the tape drives, plus everything else. And one of them even had a couple of card readers there. And all of the associated hardware feeding those computers, other computers feeding them, and of course the graphic displays they used. And of course, after we got through all of that and some of the modern electronic equipment, a tour of the basement.
See, that's the interesting thing about that is that was the present state of technology
At
for
1983.
everybody. Yeah, 1983, because I know IBM had just, I think, 84 announced the successor, which was the 4300 series.
Yeah, it came just a little later.
But you would think that they would have had perhaps even more advanced technology there.
They
than what you
apparently
could buy.
didn't. Apparently they didn't in '83. An independent group had already split off from IBM, was working on the Cray computer that became a separate corporation, of course, very large.
Seymour Cray did that, right?
Yeah, and he was originally, I believe, an IBM employee, and his whole group that went with him. And they did have a Cray 1 installed at Montauk prior to '83. I think about 78, 79. That was the first of a long series. The Cray 2 didn't come along until after '83, as I remember. We did not have a Cray 2 on board. If we'd had a Cray 5 available, they wouldn't have had a problem. But we didn't.
Okay, so
They
you're.
showed
Did
us
they keep
all
you
of
in a
this.
room? Did they keep you in a room for a while though?
They kept us in that room for a while, and we sort of looked at the equipment and so forth. Then they took us out to see other electronic equipment. They showed us. They did not show, if I remember correctly, they didn't show us the tunnel, not at first. They did later. I mean, in the first tour, there was a second tour later. But in the first tour, they didn't show us the tunnel, but they showed us some of the hardware that went along with generating the tunnel. Some of the very high-powered equipment in the basement, as it were, the huge transformer, the huge ampletrons, and a lot of the other heavy equipment,
Al, why do you
and switching
think?
gear.
Why do you think they gave you the Cook's tour?
To convince us, I believe, that we were in 1983 and not in 1943, and it was not a trick and not an illusion.
Okay, and why was it important to convince you?
I suppose one could take a number of tacks on that. They had to convince us that it was real and not illusion, so that we wouldn't think we're in some kind of a nightmare or a dream, and say, "Oh no, this isn't all real," and refuse to cooperate any further because they needed our cooperation desperately.
Okay.
So eventually we were convinced, but the thing that finally convinced us was sitting down in front of large screen color TV, which of course did not exist in '43. All we had is 10-inch black and white at that time, and there were other larger experimental systems, but no color. And there we were watching color TV, and everything from the Man in the Moon to the Cold War to freeway traffic and jams in the big cities, and the status of the Cold War. Cold War, what's that? Well, we listened and watched, and said, this doesn't fit like anything we know. And then, of course, the commercials. And the commercials are what really did it. Particularly the one, which I still think was American Airlines. It could have been any one of them. Announcing, or throwing it out into the audience, as they do in some of these commercials, on your next vacation trip to Hawaii, why not fly with us on our 747 jet? And then, of course, they show a picture of a 747 jet in flight. We look at this thing and say, huh? What's that?
I can see your jaws dropping.
Because, obviously, 747 jets or anything like it didn't exist in '43.
That's right.
The Germans had jets for the military, which they had just barely put into production, though the production versions of the ME-263, I think it was. Then there was the rocket plane, which was yet to appear in '43. But the Germans had early jets, but we had no commercial jets of any kind in 1943. No one did. So here we are suddenly introduced to a world of commercial jets. So we look at each other and says, it looks like the old man is telling it straight. So we went down to his office, looked him up, and said, okay, gentlemen, are you convinced? I said, yeah, I guess we are. He says, well, we've got a problem, and we need your help. I said, okay, what's that? He says, well, as you probably gather by now, the Eldridge was pulled out of its normal space-time location by interlocking with the Montauk project, and it's in hyperspace. And it's an artificial area, and this hyperspace bubble that it's generating is getting bigger all the time, and we don't know how large it's going to get. We don't know how long the equipment will stay on. It says theoretically it could run for 30 days until the fuel runs out on the diesels. But if nothing breaks down, it can run that long, and this bubble might get big enough to engulf the whole planet. He says, you've got to go back and shut the equipment off. I says, oh, great. And how are we supposed to get back there? We don't even know how we got here.
Yeah, it's interesting, though. Was it important that you and Duncan both
Yes,
go
it was
back?
important that we both go back.
They couldn't just send somebody else?
No, it had to be us. And we didn't understand the reasoning at that point. I think von Neumann knew the reason very well. Mm-hmm. We were already part of a time loop, and we had to close it.
Okay.
So I said, well, how are we going to get there? He says, that's no problem. Montauk here, with the equipment we have complete control and mastery over space and time. We can send you any place we want at any time we want. Well, that was rather a mouthful to swallow, that they could do all of that, but they did. They gave us a tour before we were sent back. We did go up on the surface once. We did see the, shall we say, the Montauk Tunnel hardware and the point where the tunnel would manifest. It wasn't on then.
I'm gonna throw a little curveball at you right now, and then we'll get right back to that. But
okay.
If they had that ability to send you any place, any time, why couldn't they have gone to, say, the year 2000 and pulled out some nice fancy computer hardware and brought it back and used that instead of the IBM 360s?
Well, they did change them, but the point we could make there is, yes, why not? As a matter of fact, those type of techniques were used by the United States to win World War II. Mm-hmm. A very special hardware was brought in at the time of the war with Nazi Germany, because Nazi Germany was winning over us hands down.
Oh, so you think we actually did do it?
I have this on hard information.
That's interesting. We took future technology, brought it into the present, and used it to win the war. And
also certain technical equipments, i.e. special tube receivers, were designed and built in the 80s, and not the 80s, in the 70s, by Preston Nichols, who was an RF expert, told to meet these specs. It had to be built with tubes of a vintage of 1941, 42, 43. He says, why? He says, don't ask questions, just do it. So we did. After it was tested, the piece of equipment had to go through certain specs and tests and so forth. Everything's okay. He says, all right, it's ready. But before he turned it over to his boss, he says, I don't know what's going on here, but it's something very strange. I'm putting a little piece of paper with my name and date on it inside of each one of the IF coils before I seal them up finally with their lids on them and all of this. And then they can have the receiver. We'll just wait and see what happens. I know this is a little bit of an aside, but I told him about some of these things, and he says, yes, I know. He says, one of the strange things that happened in my years of traveling around as an electronic surplus dealer and going to all these swap meets, he says, along about 79, at one of the meets up in New Hampshire, I saw a receiver that looked familiar. And he went up to it and looked at it. He said, to the guy who had it for sale, and said, where'd you get this? He says, oh, it's a standard piece of surplus equipment. And he said, the nomenclature for the nameplate for the manufacturer and the date of manufacture, the model number, all of this stuff, the whole serial numbers for the military was all on it. He looked at it and says, I think I've seen this receiver before. How much you want for it? And told him, he said, I'll buy it. He took it home, and he says to me later, he says, I swore when I saw that was the receiver I had worked on a couple of years prior in AIL in the lab and built. And it had a manufacturing date on it of 1940, with a nomenclature and nameplates for 1940 by one of the well-known manufacturers for that year. And he opens the thing up, takes the IF coil lids off, and looks down in the coils, little pieces of paper in them, pulls them out, and there's his name and there's the date.
Wow.
From about 1978, 79, whenever it was. And a receiver which was manufactured in 1940, supposedly. Now, obviously, the model must have been sent back, it had to be sent back to the people who built it in 1940. Now, why this commerce back and forth, I don't know. But there are other examples I was cited that we literally took various materials out of the future in order to beat Hitler and beat Japan.
So you think if we did not do that, we would have lost the war?
That's the info I have, yes. Hitler was head and shoulders above us until we started feeding in certain specialized hardware and, of course, found the means to build more powerful aircraft in far greater numbers than he could possibly handle. Because we were sending 1,500 numbers of bombers in one fleet over Germany, bombing the hell out of them day and night. And there's no way the fighter craft they had, no matter how many they had, could handle wave after wave of that size.
It was amazing how quickly it was designed and built.
Yes, it was. It begs another question: how were we able to design modified B-17s and then, of course, B-29s for the Pacific primarily, but they were using B-17s, B-26s, and the British Halifax bombers over Europe at that time in such large numbers. So the British weren't building most of those, we were, and we were flying them over.
Okay.
Huge convoys, pardon the expression, not a convoy per se, but flight assemblages of flying the bombers over to England, via Greenland usually. Bottom line, we beat them, and it took some specialized approaches and hardware. We can go into that in much greater detail, or more inferences, but...
Let's get to the point where they said, we need your help, you need to go back to 43.
Right. At that point, I said to him, as I had said before, I said, I don't know how you're going to do this. We don't know how we got here. And he said, we have complete control over space and time. They had given us one tour of the tunnel, not operational, past the hardware, the wall where it was installed, seeing some of the heavy equipment and so forth. And later on, I asked him, I said, how are you going to do it? He says, you've seen what we showed you about the Montauk Tunnel? He said, yes. He says, we'll ship you back through that. I says, well, how do you know where the Eldridge is? He says, we know where it is, and we know how to get you there. We'll get you there, and they did. But you're going back with radiation suits on.
Was this von Neumann?
Yes.
Who told you this?
Right.
Okay. So he seemed to sort of run the show at this point.
At this point, he did. It was his show because he knew what was coming, and even though he was only a consultant, they let him handle this aspect of it. He didn't handle much else anymore at Montauk, but that aspect he did.
So it was a radiation suit when you actually went through the tunnel?
It was not because of the tunnel. It was because of the fact we were going to go through a hyperspace field. And what they got from the way of the reports from me indicated to them that when we made the trip to 2137, we went through some hard radiation someplace in space, hyperspace, whatever it was we were in, which caused all the physical damage. We were radiation burned when we arrived in 2137. So they weren't taking any chances on it. They gave us radiation suits complete with visors, hood, gloves, everything. And I said, you want to wear these when we dump you through and put you down to the decks of the Eldridge. Says, after you're on the Eldridge, you probably won't need them. But we're taking no chances. You're going through with the suits on. When you get there, you can take them off and do what you want.
But obviously the people there in 1943, upon seeing this suit, scratched their heads saying, where the hell did that come from?
I think the guys on the deck...
well, the ones who did the investigation.
Well, that's another aspect of this.
Okay.
When we arrived back there on the deck, of course, the guys who were on the deck already, for the most part, were too far out of it to pay any attention to us. So, literally, we took off our visors and left our gloves on, found axes, and started smashing equipment, primarily the banks of 6L6s to cut the drive to the two huge alternators. Because we knew if you kill that, the magnetic fields will go down, and then the whole support system for the field would collapse. We also knew it would probably take about 2 minutes before the total field was down, and we'd be back, shall we say, permanently relocated where we started from. It was during that 2-minute gap after the generators were winding down, and when everything cleared up, that we saw the sailors in the deck, the two in the bulkhead, the fifth man, and Duncan decides to go jump overboard.
Did
See, he jumped overboard before the fields collapsed, or it would never
But
have happened.
Here's what I haven't figured out, though. You're down below deck when you're actually smashing all the equipment, right?
Partially. Part of it was smashed in the control room. I was on deck in the control room, and then part of it went into another room in the back of that, and then the rest of it was below deck.
Mm-hmm.
So we were smashing primarily the control systems, which are on deck level.
Oh, okay. And that's how you were able to see what was happening with the
Right.
sailors. Okay.
And then we came back out and saw the sailors. No, we didn't climb down a ladder and come back up. We had to go down one short one into one section for other equipment to wreck it. And then we knew the alternators were down. From that, how do we say, that secondary level below the primary level of the deck, we could see the large alternators and the drives, machinery, equipment for it, the motor and the gearboxes. We came out and then saw the sailors buried in the deck and in the bulkhead. Duncan decides to run to the deck, across the deck and to the rail and jump overboard, looking at me as he was about to go.
So you think he panicked?
I think he panicked because of seeing Brother Jim and all these other sailors in the positions of dying.
Now, this is important. You've talked to him, obviously, quite a bit since that time, and he's admitted that he has some faint memories of the Philadelphia experiment. Did he
Yes.
ever tell you why he ran off?
Never asked him. Now that I think about it. I don't know if I could get him to answer that now, but the next time I see him, I'll try and ask him that
That
one.
would be a good one to know about.
Apparently he panicked because of what he saw with the sailors and what he sensed or felt, and it was just too much for him. So he jumped overboard, he disappeared, and he went back to the future. See, if he'd waited another minute, he probably wouldn't have gone back to the future. He would have wound up in the drink. We would have fished him out of the bay water, but that didn't happen. And then, of course, the fog cleared up. They saw us. We saw the other observer ships, and then, of course, came the boarding parties, and the rest of it I've recorded. Oh, I did not mention one other aspect. After the discussion with von Neumann, and, of course, shortly after that, he was called to another aspect of his work to come up to the Los Alamos laboratories and begin the discussions on his involvement with the development of the atomic bomb.
Okay, so we're in 43.
This isn't 43. This was October 43. Probably concurrent with the third test. There was a third test of the Eldridge. They replaced all the wrecked equipment, said we'll put the ship on station, build long cables again, and remove everybody from the ship, and then run the equipment on board the ship for long cables and adjacent ship. Late in October, one night, they did this, much further downriver, so nobody could be witness to it. There were a few witnesses on shore to that ship disappearing, and they have turned up over the years, but nobody pays any attention to them, basically. And the ship disappeared. Came back about 20 minutes later, minus the cables, and when they boarded the ship, minus some of the equipment which was supposed to be operational, and some of it was on fire. So it was at that point the Navy scrapped the project. So they could clean the ship up, convert it for wartime duty, which they did. And it saw war service for a number of years until sometime in 46. In the meantime, of course, other tests were conducted elsewhere, and they were scrapped because they had the same problems. And nothing was revived until late 47. Under another code name, von Neumann was given the task to see if he could revive the project, find out what went wrong, and perhaps come up with a system that worked, which he did in 1953. But in that interim, I was sitting around, literally, in Philadelphia Navy Yard with like a bump on a log, with essentially nothing to do, just little chores here and there.
This is October?
This was in October of 1943. Another thing that was happening at the time was that my girlfriend was pregnant. The Navy refused to allow me to see her, didn't even want me to talk with her on the phone, didn't want me to communicate with anybody off base because of this Philadelphia experiment problem. It was a very serious problem. They didn't want anybody to know how serious it was. They were afraid I would talk if I got off base or anybody else got off base. There was full restrictions on us. We were quite literally under house arrest would be the best way to put it, on the base.
Yeah, but think how many people they would have had it done that to, because they had the three
It was
ships,
about
the carrier.
about 25.
What about the people in the carrier and the other ships?
Same thing. Anyone who witnessed what happened were in the same condition of house arrest. The captain, Harrison, probably was not. Von Neumann, of course, was not. They knew they'd keep their mouths shut because they were at a higher level of clearance, and said, I will, more than once, I will keep quiet.
So obviously then there are still a lot of people out there who have actually seen this experiment happen.
There may be a few left. I would
left.
say perhaps not over, my guesstimate now would be 3 or 4.
That's all.
That's all now, yes. But anyway, I had a pregnant girlfriend, and I said to Neumann, I says, look, I want to marry her. They won't let me off base, won't let me see her. He says, can you arrange something? He says, let me see what I can do. So Von Neumann was very helpful, and he had a lot of clout at that time, even on the Navy base. So he arranged, actually, because I did still travel back and forth from the Navy base to the Institute of Advanced Study, because we were still doing some communication and work back and forth. He finally arranged that I would be married to my wife-to-be and the chapel at the Institute, or actually on Princeton grounds. A Navy chaplain officiated, and we were married in February of 1944. My son Jeff was born, and I remained there doing chores. So Von Neumann occasionally. Finally, he asked me, would I be interested in coming up and working in Los Alamos? I said, well, what's involved? And he told me, and I said, yeah, why not? At least get out of here. So he suggested to the Navy I'd like to have me up there, that I could assist him. I knew my math very well. And he says, I need assistance on the project. And the Navy said, fine. In fact, they were very happy to get me out of Philadelphia and out of, shall we say, into an area where we were totally secluded, because Los Alamos base at that time was the most secret base in the U.S.
Now, did they give you a thorough interrogation as to what happened to you? Where did this suit come from? Those sort of things, do you recall?
No, they didn't give me a thorough interrogation about that. See, there was one suit left on the deck. That was
Right.
mine. The other one remained on Duncan when he jumped overboard to go back to the future. So there was only one suit left, and they thought that was awfully strange.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't ask me any questions about it, and I didn't give them any answers. It's very peculiar that the story of the suit should turn up much later, decades later. Now, I'm not in a position to say who became involved with this. It was a very close friend of mine here in the Atlanta area, who at some time in his career in the past, working with the government, at one of the meetings was called in, and sitting on the table was a spacesuit, or what appeared to be a spacesuit with a visor and everything else, exactly like I've described it. And they asked him, what do you know about this suit? And he looked at it and he says, not a damn thing. What is it? He says, well, it's a radiation-proof suit and so forth. Do you know anything about it? No, I don't. He found out later it was the one that came from the deck of the Eldridge.
How in the world did he get that?
He was in very high-level clearance at that time, and he was doing work for our special agencies within the government. And why he was queried on it, I have no idea. He doesn't either. But apparently they were asking everybody for ideas, whatever the motivation was. Don't know. But in any case, I went to Los Alamos and was there from July 44 with family, and to July 4th, sometime in July 44 to July 4th of 1947. I uncovered a lot of things in the Black Vault, which I was given after the war was over, full access to, because the Navy wanted me to write a classified report dealing with the development of the atomic bomb, and I had access to everything that was in their vault, which included the German records of their work on developing a bomb, where theirs came from.
So you knew all the key people.
I know all the key people,
Wow.
including Oppenheimer, quite well.